Welcome, weary wanderer, to the haunted realms where spectral riders gallop through winter skies and ancient magic flows like blood through dying worlds. Tonight we explore the complete saga of the Wild Hunt, from their origins as noble elven cavalry to their transformation into wraith-like harbingers of doom. This is a tale of conquest and corruption, of elder blood and frozen wastelands, of kings who would sacrifice worlds for power. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow, and drift with us through dimensions where skeletal knights pursue their eternal quarry across the dying light of countless stars. In the distant reaches of time, long before the kingdoms we know had taken their first breath, or the heroes of legend had drawn their first swords, the very fabric of reality itself trembled on the edge of an event so profound that it would reshape not merely one world but all worlds that had ever existed or ever would exist. This was 1500 years before the age of witches and sorceresses, before the rise of Nilfgaard or the founding of the northern kingdoms, in an era when the universe itself was still young and malleable, still learning the rules that would govern existence for all the ages to come. The event that would change everything was known by scholars in later times as the conjunction of the spheres, though even that name carries within it only the faintest echo of the true magnitude of what occurred. This was not merely a collision between worlds, but a fundamental restructuring of reality itself, as if the very foundations upon which all existence rested had been torn apart and rewoven into patterns that defied every natural law that had previously governed the cosmos. Imagine, if you will, soap bubbles floating in an infinite void, each one containing its own complete universe with its own laws of physics, its own forms of life, its own understanding of what was possible and what was impossible. For countless eons, these spheres of reality had drifted through the cosmic darkness in perfect isolation, each one a closed system where cause and effect followed predictable patterns, and the impossible remained safely impossible. But on that day, 15 centuries past, something went catastrophically wrong with the very structure of existence itself. Perhaps it was the will of beings so ancient and powerful that their names have been forgotten by time itself. Perhaps it was simply the inevitable result of forces that had been building across eternity, like a dam that had finally reached the limits of what it could contain. Or perhaps it was nothing more than cosmic accident, a moment of divine carelessness that would echo across all possible futures. Whatever the cause, the barriers between the spheres began to weaken and crack like eggshells under pressure. Reality itself developed fractures that spread like spider webs through the fabric of space and time, creating pathways between worlds that had never been meant to touch. The impossible became possible, the separate became merged, and the ordered universe dissolved into chaos more profound than anything that had existed since the first moment of creation. As the spheres collided and merged, creatures and phenomena that had existed in complete isolation from one another suddenly found themselves sharing the same space, the same air, the same fundamental reality. Dragons that had ruled over worlds of pure fire found themselves sharing skies with beings of living water. Forests of crystal suddenly sprouted alongside meadows of flesh and bone. Most importantly of all, the mystical force that some worlds had known as magic, others as chaos, and still others by names that have no translation in any mortal tongue, began to flow between the merged spheres like blood through newly opened arteries. This cosmic catastrophe brought together not merely different forms of matter and energy, but different ways of understanding reality itself. Magic, which had existed in some worlds as a fundamental force, as natural as gravity or light, suddenly became available to creatures who had never dreamed such things were possible. The very concept of what was real and what was impossible had to be rewritten as beings who had lived their entire existence bound by one set of natural laws suddenly discovered that entirely different rules could apply. Among the countless worlds that merged during this great conjunction was a realm that would later be known simply as the continent, though at the time of the merging, it had no name because it had no inhabitants capable of giving it one. This world was rich in natural beauty, its landscapes varied and fertile, its climate moderate enough to support countless forms of life. Rivers of clear water flowed through valleys green with vegetation, while mountains rich in metals and gems rose towards skies that had never been stained by the smoke of war or industry. Yet this world was not empty when the conjunction occurred. Two forms of intelligent life had already made their homes in its forests and plains, though they were so different from one another that they might as well have existed in completely separate realities. The first were humans, though these bore little resemblance to the humans we know from later ages. They lived simple lives in harmony with the natural world around them, their settlements small and scattered, their understanding of technology limited to the most basic tools and weapons. These ancient humans were peaceful by nature, more concerned with understanding the rhythms of the seasons and the movements of wild animals than with concepts like conquest or expansion. They had developed no written language, built no great cities, created no complex social hierarchies. Their lives were short and simple, measured not in grand achievements but in small moments of beauty and connection with the world around them. The second form of intelligent life was even more removed from anything the merged worlds had previously contained. These were the unicorns, creatures of such purity and grace that they seemed to exist partially outside the normal flow of time and space. Unlike the earthbound humans with their crude tools and basic shelters, the unicorns possessed abilities that bordered on the divine, including, most importantly, the power to open pathways between different dimensions of reality. The unicorns had lived on this unnamed continent for countless generations, their presence bringing a kind of sanctity to the very air and water around them. They were guardians of natural balance, protectors of innocence, living embodiments of everything that was pure and uncorrupted in the world. Their magic was not the chaotic, unpredictable force that would later be wielded by mortal sorcerers, but something far more fundamental and stable, woven into the very fabric of reality itself. When the conjunction occurred and the barriers between worlds began to collapse, these two innocent species suddenly found themselves sharing their peaceful realm with creatures and forces beyond their worst nightmares. Monsters that had evolved in dimensions of pure darkness and hunger came pouring through the dimensional rifts like a plague of living nightmares. Ghouls that could drain the life from any living thing they touched. Basilisks whose very gaze could turn flesh to stone. Vampires that viewed mortal blood as both sustenance and entertainment. But perhaps even more significant than these obvious monsters was the arrival of the various intelligent races that would go on to populate the continent in later ages. Dwarves emerged from worlds of underground cities and endless mines. Their knowledge of metalwork and stone carving advanced beyond anything the native humans had ever imagined. Halflings came from pastoral realms, where the greatest concerns had been the proper cultivation of gardens and the brewing of exceptional ales. Gnomes brought with them technologies and alchemical knowledge that seemed to blur the line between science and magic. Most importantly of all, at least for the story we follow tonight, the conjunction brought elves, but not just any elves. Dozens of different varieties from worlds, so different that they might have been entirely separate species. There were the Ain Sadi, the elves who would remain on the continent and eventually be conquered by human expansion. There were sea elves who dwelt beneath the waves, mountain elves who made their homes among perpetual snows, and forest elves whose lives were so intertwined with their woodland homes that they could barely exist apart from them. And then there were the Ain El, the elves who called themselves the Elder Folk, whose arrival would set in motion the chain of events that would eventually give birth to the terror known as the Wild Hunt. The Ain El came from a world that was already dying when the conjunction occurred. Their original homeworld, known in their ancient tongue as Ain Shie, had been slowly consumed by a cosmic phenomenon. They called the White Frost a creeping wave of supernatural cold that turned everything it touched into lifeless ice and stone. This was not merely winter or even an ice age, but something far more fundamental and final, a force that didn't just freeze things but drained them of the very essence that made life possible. For generations, the ANL had watched their beautiful homeworld succumb to this creeping death, its forests becoming sculptures of ice, its cities transformed into crystal tombs, its people fleeing ever southward ahead of the advancing cold. They were a proud race, these elder folk, possessed of magic and technology far beyond anything the other elven varieties had achieved. Their lifespans stretched across centuries, allowing them to accumulate knowledge and wisdom that shorter-lived races could barely comprehend. Yet for all their power and knowledge, they had been helpless to stop the white frost that consumed their world. They could slow it, perhaps, deflect it temporarily from certain areas, but they could not defeat it or drive it back. It was as inevitable as entropy itself, as unstoppable as the heat death of the universe. All they could do was delay the inevitable, while they searched desperately for some means of escape. When the conjunction of the spheres created pathways between worlds, the Ain El saw their chance. Using magical techniques that had been developed over centuries of studying dimensional barriers, they opened portals between their dying world and the new reality that was forming from the merger of countless spheres. Through these rifts in space and time, they began an exodus that would carry the survivors of their civilization to what they hoped would be a new beginning. The world they found beyond the portals was unlike anything they had known in Ain Shai. Where their homeworld had been dying, this new realm pulsed with vibrant life. Where their skies had been grey with the promise of eternal winter, these heavens blazed with the light of a sun that seemed to offer warmth and hope without limit. Most importantly of all, there was no sign of the white frost here, no creeping cold that would eventually consume everything they tried to build. The Ain El established their first settlements in regions of spectacular natural beauty, choosing locations that reminded them of their lost homeworld before the coming of the white frost. They built with magic and technology that far exceeded anything the native inhabitants had ever imagined, creating structures that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, while incorporating engineering principles that would not be discovered by human science for thousands of years. Their capital city, which they named Tir Nalia, in honor of their ancient goddess of beginnings, rose from a valley of such perfect natural beauty that it seemed to have been designed by divine hands specifically for their habitation. The city itself was a masterwork of elven architecture and magical engineering, its spires reaching toward the sky like prayers made manifest in stone and crystal. Gardens of impossible beauty surrounded every building, while streams of clear water flowed through carefully designed channels that brought the music of running water to every district. The magic that flowed through this new world proved to be remarkably compatible with the techniques the Ain El had developed in their homeland, but it was also different in ways that would have profound implications for their future development. This was chaos magic, raw and untamed, compared to the refined energies they had worked with before, but also more powerful and more flexible. It responded to will and emotion in ways their old magic never had, opening up possibilities that even their ancient knowledge had never contemplated. For the first time in centuries, the Ain El allowed themselves to hope. Here was a world that could become their new home, a place where their civilization could not merely survive, but thrive and grow beyond anything they had achieved in Ainshey. The White Frost was a distant memory now, left behind in a dying world that existed on the other side of dimensional barriers they could control and maintain. Yet their joy at finding sanctuary was tempered by the discovery that this beautiful new world was not uninhabited. The presence of the primitive humans was not particularly concerning. They were clearly inferior in every way that the Ain-El considered important, possessing no advanced technology, no sophisticated magic, nor complex social structures. They seemed little more than clever animals, barely above the level of the various non-sentient creatures that roamed the forests and plains. The unicorns, however, represented a different kind of challenge entirely. These creatures possessed magical abilities that even the Ain-El respected, and their deep connection to the natural world gave them a kind of authority over the realm that the elves could not simply dismiss. More troubling still, the unicorns seemed to disapprove of the Ain-El's presence, as if they sensed something in the nature of the elder folk that was incompatible with the harmony they had maintained for so long. The conflict that followed was not immediate, for the Ain-El were not a hasty people. They spent years studying their new environment, learning its rhythms and understanding its possibilities. They mapped the locations of valuable resources, identified the most defensible positions for future settlements, and observed the behavioral patterns of both the humans and the unicorns who shared their new home. But as time passed, and their understanding of the situation deepened, the Ain-El began to reach conclusions that would shape the destiny of their people for centuries to come. This world had the potential to become everything they had lost when the White Frost consumed Ainshey, but only if they were willing to claim it fully and completely. Half measures would not suffice. They needed to establish absolute dominance over their new realm if they were to build the kind of civilization their people deserved. The primitive humans, with their crude tools and simple social structures, were clearly incapable of developing this world's potential. They lived like animals, taking only what they needed from the land without any understanding of how to improve or enhance what nature had provided. In the Ain-El's view, allowing them to continue their primitive existence would be a waste of resources that bordered on criminal negligence. The unicorns, despite their magical abilities, represented an even greater obstacle to the Ain-El's plans. Their philosophy of living in harmony with nature was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of advanced civilization the elder folk intended to build. More troubling still, their ability to open dimensional pathways meant they could potentially interfere with the Ain-El's control over the portals that connected this world to other realms. And so, after years of careful planning and preparation, the Ain-El made the decision that would define their relationship with this new world for all the ages to come. If they were to build the civilization they envisioned, the other intelligent inhabitants would have to be eliminated or subjugated. There was simply no room in their grand design for the primitive humans or the sanctimonious unicorns, who seemed to believe their mere presence gave them some kind of moral authority over the realm. The war that followed was not really a war in any conventional sense, for it lacked any meaningful opposition. The humans, with their stone tools and leather armor, were utterly helpless against enemies who wielded magic as naturally as breathing and possessed weapons forged from metals they had never seen. Entire human settlements were destroyed in single nights, their inhabitants either killed outright or captured for purposes the Ain-El had not yet fully defined. The campaign against the humans was systematic and thorough, carried out with the same careful planning that had characterized everything else the Ain-El did. They identified every human settlement, no matter how small or remote, and methodically destroyed them one by one. Those humans who tried to flee were hunted down by elven cavalry units whose mounts could run faster and longer than any horse the primitive tribes possessed. Within a single generation, the human population of the continent had been completely eradicated. Not a single member of that peaceful, primitive race survived the ANL's campaign of extermination. Their simple settlements were burned to the ground, their crude tools and weapons melted down for scrap metal, their very existence erased so thoroughly that in later ages there would be no trace that they had ever lived on this world at all. The unicorns proved to be a more challenging opponent, for their magical abilities allowed them to evade the ANL's forces in ways the humans never could. They could sense danger from great distances, teleport themselves away from immediate threats, and even temporarily shift into dimensions where the elven weapons could not reach them. Many of the pure-hearted creatures managed to escape the initial waves of the ANL invasion by fleeing to remote areas where their connection to the natural world provided both concealment and protection. Yet even the unicorn's superior magical abilities could not protect them indefinitely from enemies who possessed both superior numbers and far more sophisticated tactical knowledge. The ANL had spent centuries perfecting the arts of war during their struggles against the creatures that had invaded Ainshea during the final days before the White Frost consumed their homeworld. They understood how to hunt creatures of great magical power, how to counter defensive spells, how to force battles on terms that favored their own strengths while minimizing their enemies' advantages. More importantly, the unicorn's very nature worked against them in this conflict. Their deep connection to the natural world meant they could not simply abandon the places they had protected for so long. Their commitment to preserving innocence meant they continued trying to protect other creatures even when doing so exposed them to danger. Their refusal to use their magical abilities for purely destructive purposes meant they could not simply annihilate their enemies the way the ANL were willing to annihilate them. The final phase of the campaign against the unicorns was not a battle, but a series of carefully orchestrated hunts. The surviving creatures were tracked to their hidden sanctuaries and, surrounded by overwhelming force, offered the choice between death and cooperation. Most chose a third option. They agreed to a form of slavery that was presented to them as a temporary arrangement that would protect what remained of the natural world they had served for so long. The terms of this surrender were deceptively reasonable on their surface. The unicorns would be allowed to continue existing, and certain areas of the continent would be preserved as sanctuaries where the natural world could continue to flourish according to its own rhythms. In exchange, they would provide the ANL with access to their most precious ability, the power to open and maintain dimensional pathways between different worlds. What the unicorns did not understand at the time was that they were agreeing to become the foundation upon which an empire of unprecedented scope and cruelty would be built. The dimensional pathways they could create would allow the ANL to extend their reach far beyond this single world, turning them from refugees seeking sanctuary into conquerors capable of raiding any realm they chose. The power that the unicorns had used to preserve and protect would become the very tool by which countless other worlds would be pillaged and enslaved. With the native populations eliminated or subjugated, the ANL were free to begin building the civilization they had dreamed of during the dark years when the White Frost slowly consumed their homeland. Tir Nalia expanded from a single city into a sprawling metropolis that covered the entire valley and spread outward into the surrounding hills. Smaller settlements were established at strategic points throughout the continent, each one designed according to principles of magical architecture that created harmony between the built environment and the natural world around it. The society that emerged was everything the ANL had lost when they were forced to flee Ainshea, but refined and perfected through centuries of accumulated wisdom. Their government was a carefully balanced monarchy that combined absolute royal authority with advisory councils drawn from the most skilled and knowledgeable members of their society. Their economy was based on principles of magical enhancement and technological innovation that allowed them to extract maximum value from every natural resource while maintaining the beauty of their environment. Most importantly of all, they had achieved the security that had been denied to them in their homeland. The white frost that had consumed Iron Shea was locked away on the other side of dimensional barriers they could control completely. Even if that cosmic plague somehow found a way to breach those barriers, they now possessed the knowledge and the means to flee to other worlds, carrying their entire civilization with them if necessary. As decades passed into centuries, the Ainel began to develop ambitions that went far beyond merely rebuilding what they had lost. This world that had become their new home was rich in resources and beauty, but it was still just one world among the countless realms that existed beyond the dimensional barriers. With the unicorn's abilities at their disposal, there was no reason to limit themselves to the resources and opportunities that a single world could provide. The philosophical justification for this expansion was not difficult for them to construct. They had proven their superiority by conquering this world and establishing a civilization of unprecedented beauty and sophistication. They had demonstrated their right to rule by building something magnificent from the ashes of primitive savagery. If other worlds contained resources they needed, or creatures that could serve their purposes, was it not their responsibility to claim those resources and organize those creatures according to principles that would benefit everyone involved? The decision to begin systematic raids on other dimensions was not made hastily or without careful consideration of all the implications involved. The Ainel spent years studying the dimensional pathways that the unicorns could create, mapping the locations of worlds that contained the resources they desired, and developing strategies for conducting operations across the vast distances that separated different realms of reality. What they needed most urgently was not resources, but labor. The civilization they had built was magnificent, but required constant maintenance and expansion that strained the capabilities of their population. The INL were long-lived, but not particularly fertile, and their numbers had been reduced by the disasters that had driven them from Iron Shea. If they were to build the empire they now envisioned, they would need workers. Countless numbers of workers who could perform the tedious tasks that were beneath the dignity of the elder folk, but essential for maintaining their way of life. Slaves, in other words, though the Ainel preferred to think of them as servants, or even as grateful subjects who would benefit from being incorporated into a superior civilization. The philosophical framework they developed to justify this enterprise was elegant and comprehensive, addressing every possible moral objection while providing clear guidelines for how such operations should be conducted. And so, in the growing shadows of their beautiful new world, as the spires of Tirnalia reached ever higher toward the stars, and the elder folk congratulated themselves on their successful escape from the dying realm of their birth, the first plans were laid for what would eventually become the most feared and hated organization in all the countless worlds that existed beyond the dimensional barriers. The Ainel, who had once been refugees fleeing cosmic disaster, were about to transform themselves into something far more terrible. The predators who would stalk the dreams of countless innocent souls across a dozen different realities. In the halls of Tirnalia, where crystal spires caught the morning light and transformed it into rainbows that danced across walls of living stone, King Oberon Mursatash sat upon the throne of stars and contemplated the expansion of his realm beyond the boundaries of any single world. The throne itself was a marvel of elven craftsmanship, carved from a single piece of meteoric crystal that had fallen from the skies of Ain Shai in the final days before the white frost consumed their ancestral home. It pulsed with a gentle inner light that seemed to respond to the monarch's thoughts and emotions, growing brighter when he was pleased and dimming to near darkness when his mood turned contemplative or melancholy. The king was ancient even by the standards of his long-lived people, having ruled for over 6 centuries since the establishment of their new homeland. His face bore the refined beauty that characterized all of the elder folk, but it was marked by lines that spoke of wisdom, earned through countless seasons of responsibility and decision-making. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect not merely his personal experiences, but the accumulated memory of his entire race, the joys and sorrows of a people who had lost one world and claimed another through force of will and superior might. Around him, the throne room itself told the story of elven achievement and ambition. The walls were covered with tapestries that depicted scenes from their history, from the golden age of Ain Shai before the coming of the White Frost to their triumphant conquest of this new realm. Intricate carvings showed battles against monsters and lesser races, the establishment of their great cities, the taming of wild landscapes, and their transformation into gardens of impossible beauty. Every surface spoke of a people who saw themselves not merely as survivors, but as the rightful inheritors of any world they chose to claim. Yet for all the magnificence that surrounded him, King Oberon found his thoughts drawn increasingly to the limitations that still constrained his people's destiny. They had built a civilization that surpassed anything they had achieved in their homeland, created art and architecture that would be remembered for millennia, established a society based on principles of order and beauty that elevated every aspect of daily life. But they remained confined to a single world, their magnificent culture limited by the boundaries of one realm, no matter how rich and beautiful that realm might be. The unicorns, those pure-hearted creatures whose abilities had made possible the Ainel's escape from their dying homeworld, possessed the power to change this situation completely. Through the dimensional pathways they could create and maintain, the entire multiverse lay open to elven exploration and expansion. Countless worlds waited beyond the barriers of space and time, each one containing resources that could enhance elven civilization, territories that could be claimed and improved according to elven principles, and most importantly of all, populations that could be organized and directed according to elven wisdom. The philosophical framework that justified this expansion had been developed over decades of careful deliberation by the finest minds in elven society. The Ainel had proven their superiority through their achievements. They had fled the destruction of their homeland and established something even greater in its place. They had encountered inferior races and either eliminated them when they posed obstacles or incorporated them when they could serve useful purposes. They had taken a world of primitive chaos and transformed it into a realm of ordered beauty that reflected the highest aspirations of intelligent life. Given these demonstrated achievements, was it not their responsibility to extend their beneficial influence to other worlds that lacked the wisdom and capability to develop their own potential? The multiverse was filled with primitive societies that barely deserved the name of civilization, with resources being wasted through ignorance and mismanagement, with intelligent creatures living in squalor and barbarism, when they could be elevated through exposure to elven culture and organization. The decision to begin systematic expansion beyond their current world was not made in haste or without careful consideration of all factors involved. King Oberon consulted with his advisors, studied reports from scouts who had made preliminary expeditions through the dimensional pathways, and spent long hours in meditation attempting to understand the will of their ancient gods regarding this momentous undertaking. The conclusion he eventually reached was as clear as it was inevitable. The Ainel had not merely the right, but the obligation to claim dominion over any world they could reach and improve. The practical challenges involved in such an undertaking were considerable, but not insurmountable. Dimensional travel was still largely dependent on the cooperation of the unicorns, and those pure-hearted creatures had shown increasing reluctance to assist in operations that involved violence against innocent populations. The portals they could create were limited in size and duration, making it difficult to transport large numbers of troops or substantial quantities of supplies across the dimensional barriers. Most significantly of all, the Ainel themselves were not well suited for the kind of sustained military operations that would be required for effective interdimensional conquest. They were scholars and artists, philosophers and craftsmen, individuals whose talents lay in the creation of beauty and the contemplation of abstract truths rather than in the crude business of warfare and subjugation. Their population was small, their birth rate low, and their natural inclination toward peaceful pursuits meant they had little experience with the kind of systematic violence that conquest would require. What they needed was a military organization specifically designed for interdimensional operations, a force that could be deployed quickly through the dimensional pathways and operate effectively in alien environments against unfamiliar enemies. This organization would need to be more than just an army. It would need to be a projection of elven power and authority that could intimidate potential enemies into submission, while also serving as a tool for the systematic exploitation of conquered territories. King Oberon's solution to these challenges was characteristically elegant and comprehensive. He would create a new military unit that combined the mobility necessary for interdimensional operations with the psychological impact required to minimize actual fighting. This force would be built around the principle of cavalry, utilizing mounted warriors whose speed and agility would allow them to strike quickly and withdraw before effective resistance could be organized. The horses selected for this unit were not the ordinary animals that roamed the plains of their new world, but creatures that had been magically enhanced through techniques developed by the finest elven enchanters. These steeds were larger and stronger than natural horses, capable of carrying fully armored riders across vast distances without tiring. More importantly, they had been imbued with supernatural intelligence and loyalty that made them perfect partners for warriors who might need to operate in alien environments where conventional military tactics would be useless. The breeding program that produced these magnificent mounts took several years to complete and involved magical techniques that pushed the boundaries of what even elven sorcery could accomplish. The horses were selectively bred for size, strength, and endurance, but they were also exposed to enchantments that enhanced their natural abilities far beyond anything that selective breeding alone could achieve. Their hooves were hardened to the point where they could strike sparks from solid stone. Their muscles were enhanced to provide strength that bordered on the supernatural, and their senses were sharpened until they could detect enemies at distances that would challenge even elven perception. Perhaps most importantly of all, these enhanced steeds were trained to remain calm and obedient, even in the most chaotic and terrifying circumstances. They would not shy away from the sight of blood or the sounds of battle, would not panic when confronted with alien monsters or supernatural phenomena, would not hesitate to charge directly into formations of enemy warriors, no matter how numerous or well-armed those enemies might be. The color chosen for these magnificent war horses was as significant as their physical and mental enhancements. Every single mount was jet black, a shade so deep and uniform that they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In daylight, they appeared as moving shadows, while at night, they became virtually invisible, except for the gleam of their eyes and the sound of their hooves against whatever surface they traveled across. This choice of color was not merely aesthetic, but served important, practical, and psychological purposes. Black horses would be more difficult for enemies to see and target during night operations, which the Ainel anticipated would be their preferred time for conducting raids. More importantly, the sight of these shadow-dark steeds would contribute to the supernatural terror that the new military unit was designed to inspire in anyone who witnessed their approach. The riders selected for these enhanced mounts were drawn from the finest warriors in Elven society, individuals who combined exceptional combat skills with the intelligence and adaptability necessary for operations in unknown territories against unpredictable enemies. Each candidate underwent months of rigorous testing that evaluated not only their physical abilities and weapons proficiency, but also their psychological suitability for the kind of work they would be expected to perform. The selection process was designed to identify elves who possessed the rare combination of qualities that would be essential for interdimensional raiders. They needed to be skilled enough in combat to defeat any enemy they might encounter, but also intelligent enough to adapt quickly to alien environments and unfamiliar tactical situations. They required the courage necessary to charge into battle against overwhelming odds, but also the discipline to withdraw when continued fighting would be counterproductive. Perhaps most importantly of all, they needed to possess the particular type of mental flexibility that would allow them to view the inhabitants of other worlds not as fellow intelligent beings deserving of respect and consideration, but as resources to be harvested and obstacles to be eliminated. This was not a natural mindset for most elves, who had spent centuries developing their appreciation for beauty, wisdom, and the subtle complexities of civilized existence. The training program that transformed these selected warriors into effective interdimensional raiders was unlike anything that had been attempted before in Elven military history. It combined traditional combat instruction with specialized techniques developed specifically for operations across dimensional boundaries. The riders learned to fight effectively while mounted on their enhanced steeds, mastering weapons and tactics that took advantage of their superior mobility while minimizing their exposure to enemy counterattacks. They studied the art of rapid deployment, learning to organize and execute complex military operations with minimal preparation time and limited intelligence about enemy capabilities. They practiced fighting in environments that simulated the alien conditions they might encounter in other worlds, from landscapes of perpetual darkness to realms where the very air was toxic to elven physiology. Most importantly of all, they underwent psychological conditioning, designed to suppress the natural empathy and moral restraints that would interfere with their effectiveness as raiders and slavers. Through techniques that combined magical influence with systematic desensitization, they learned to view the suffering of non-elves as irrelevant to their mission objectives, to treat intelligent creatures as nothing more than valuable cargo to be collected and transported. The commander chosen to lead this new military unit was Eredin Break Glass, a warrior whose reputation had been established through decades of service in the campaigns against the unicorns and the various monsters that had invaded their world during the aftermath of the conjunction of the spheres. Eredin was relatively young by Elven standards, but had already distinguished himself as a tactical innovator whose unconventional approaches to military problems had achieved results that more traditional commanders had found impossible. What set Eredin apart from his peers was not merely his skill with weapons or his understanding of battlefield tactics, but his capacity for the kind of ruthless pragmatism that their new enterprise would require. Where other elven commanders might hesitate to employ methods that contradicted traditional notions of honor and fair play, Eredin possessed the mental flexibility necessary to adapt his approach to whatever circumstances he encountered. His physical presence was perfectly suited to his new role as leader of an organization designed to inspire terror in its enemies. Tall even by elven standards, With the pale complexion and sharp features that characterized the nobility of his people, he possessed a natural authority that made other elves instinctively defer to his judgment. His eyes were perhaps his most memorable feature, pale blue orbs that seemed to look through rather than at whatever they focused upon, as if he could perceive truths that remained hidden from lesser minds. The armor designed for Eredin and his warriors represented a masterpiece of both protective engineering and psychological warfare. The basic design was based on traditional elven military equipment, but it had been modified extensively to serve the specific needs of interdimensional raiders. Each suit was crafted from metals that had been magically enhanced to provide protection against not only conventional weapons, but also the various forms of supernatural attack they might encounter in alien worlds. The most distinctive feature of this armor was its skeletal motifs, decorative elements that had been incorporated into the design to maximize the psychological impact on anyone who witnessed the raiders in action. The breastplates were shaped and decorated to resemble the rib cages of some enormous predator, while the helmets incorporated skull-like features that transformed the wearer's face into a mask of death and judgment. These skeletal elements served multiple purposes beyond mere intimidation. In the heat of battle, when visibility might be limited and identification of friend versus enemy could mean the difference between life and death, the distinctive appearance of the armor would allow the raiders to recognize each other instantly. More subtly, the death imagery was designed to reinforce in the minds of both the raiders and their enemies the fundamental nature of their relationship. The Ain El were harbingers of endings, beings whose arrival marked the conclusion of whatever previous order had existed in the territories they claimed. The weapons carried by the new raiders were as distinctive and carefully designed as their armor and mounts. Each warrior was equipped with a curved sword that had been forged using techniques that combined traditional elven metallurgy with magical enhancement. These blades were sharp enough to cut through most forms of armor and strong enough to maintain their edge, even after extended use against the hardest materials. In addition to their primary weapons, the raiders carried an assortment of secondary armaments designed to handle specific tactical situations. Crossbows provided them with effective ranged weapons that could be used while mounted. Their bolts enhanced with minor enchantments that improved their accuracy and penetrating power. Daggers and throwing knives offered options for close combat or silent elimination of sentries and scouts. Perhaps most importantly of all, each raider was equipped with magical implements that could be used to capture and transport prisoners across dimensional boundaries. These included nets, woven from materials that could restrain even creatures possessing supernatural strength, shackles that prevented the use of magical abilities, and various alchemical compounds that could render captives unconscious or compliant without causing permanent harm. The insignia chosen for the new military unit reflected both their intended function and their position within the broader structure of elven society. They would be known as the Dir Gruadri, a term that translated approximately as Red Riders in the common tongues of other worlds. The name derived from the crimson cloaks that each warrior wore over their skeletal armor, garments that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The practical benefits of the red cloaks were considerable. They provided additional protection against cold and weather, important considerations for warriors who might need to operate in hostile environments for extended periods. They could be used as blankets or ground coverings during camping, as bandages in medical emergencies, or as signals for communication across long distances. Symbolically, the red color was chosen to represent the blood that would inevitably be spilled during their operations, but also the vitality and passion that drove the elven people in their quest for expansion and dominance. The cloak served as a visible reminder to both the raiders and their enemies of the fundamental nature of their relationship. The ANL were predators, and everyone else was prey. The sight of these crimson-cloaked riders on their jet-black steeds, their skeletal armor gleaming in whatever light was available, created an image that was designed to burn itself into the memory of anyone who witnessed it. This was not accidental, but represented the culmination of months of careful planning and psychological research. The ANL understood that the most effective weapon they possessed was not their superior technology or magical abilities, but the terror they could inspire in the minds of their enemies. The first operations conducted by the Dia Gruadri were planned with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized everything the ANL attempted. King Oberon and his advisors spent months studying the reports brought back by scouts who had made preliminary expeditions through the dimensional pathways, identifying worlds that contained the resources they desired while presenting minimal risks to the raiding forces. The initial target selected for the Red Riders' first major operation was a world inhabited by humans whose technological development was roughly equivalent to what the ANL remembered from their encounters with the primitive tribes they had eliminated after their arrival in this realm. These humans had developed agriculture and basic metalworking, had established permanent settlements and rudimentary forms of government, but they possessed no significant magical abilities and no weapons that could pose a serious threat to magically enhanced elven warriors. More importantly, intelligence reports suggested that this human civilization was fragmented into numerous small kingdoms and city-states that maintained only limited contact with each other. This political fragmentation would work to the ANL's advantage, as it would be impossible for the humans to organize effective resistance against raiders who could strike at multiple targets simultaneously and withdraw before reinforcements could arrive. The portal through which the Red Riders would travel to this target world was opened in a carefully prepared chamber deep beneath Tirnalia, far from the eyes of anyone who might disapprove of what was about to transpire. The unicorns who created and maintained the dimensional pathway had been carefully managed to ensure their cooperation through a combination of subtle magical influence and carefully crafted agreements that concealed the true nature of the expedition they were enabling. As the shimmering gateway between worlds stabilized and the alien landscape beyond became visible through the dimensional barrier, Eredin gathered his warriors for final instructions and encouragement. The speech he delivered on that historic occasion would be remembered and repeated for centuries afterward, becoming part of the foundational mythology of what would eventually become the most feared organization in all the worlds that lay beyond the barriers of normal space and time. Standing before his assembled riders in their magnificent armor and crimson cloaks, their enhanced steeds stamping impatiently as they sensed the approaching moment of action, Eredin spoke words that transformed a military expedition into something approaching a sacred mission. They were not merely raiders seeking plunder, he told them, but the instruments through which elven civilization would be extended to worlds that desperately needed the guidance and organization that only the Elder Folk could provide. The creatures they would encounter in the alien world beyond the portal were not truly their enemies, he explained, but rather unfortunate beings who had been denied the benefits of proper leadership and education. By capturing the strongest and most intelligent among them, and bringing them back to serve elven society, the Red Riders would actually be performing an act of mercy, rescuing these primitive creatures from lives of ignorance and waste. Those who resisted or proved unsuitable for incorporation into elven society would need to be eliminated. But this too was an act of compassion when properly understood. Such beings were clearly defective in ways that made peaceful coexistence impossible, and allowing them to continue their destructive existence would only lead to greater suffering for everyone involved. With these philosophical justifications firmly established in the minds of his warriors, Eredin led the first interdimensional raid in the history of the Ainel. The sight of the Red Riders charging through the dimensional portal on their shadow-dark mounts, their skeletal armor gleaming and their crimson cloaks streaming behind them like rivers of blood, would have been magnificent and terrifying even if no enemies had been waiting on the other side. The world they entered was everything the intelligence reports had suggested and more. Rolling plains of green grass stretched to distant horizons, broken by forests of oak and elm that reminded the elven warriors of the landscapes they had known in Ironshade before the coming of the White Frost. Rivers of clear water flowed through valleys where human settlements clustered around crude fortifications of earth and timber, their inhabitants going about their daily lives with no awareness that their world was about to change forever. The first target selected for the Red Riders' assault was a farming village whose population appeared to number perhaps 300 or 400 individuals. Intelligence suggested that this community possessed no significant military capabilities and would be unable to offer meaningful resistance to a force of magically enhanced elven cavalry. More importantly, the village's isolation meant that news of the attack would not spread quickly to other human settlements, providing the raiders with the element of surprise they would need for subsequent operations. The assault itself unfolded with the precision and efficiency that months of training and preparation had made possible. The Red Riders emerged from the forest surrounding the village at dawn, when most of the inhabitants were just beginning their daily routines. The sight of skeletal warriors on jet-black horses charging out of the morning mist created exactly the psychological impact that the planners had intended. The panic, so complete and overwhelming that organized resistance became impossible. Some of the humans attempted to flee, but the enhanced speed of the elven mounts made escape impossible for anyone caught in the open. Others tried to barricade themselves inside their crude dwellings, but structures built from timber and mud brick provided no meaningful protection against warriors equipped with magically enhanced weapons. A few of the village's young men attempted to organize some form of defense, but their primitive weapons and lack of military training made them ineffective against enemies whose superior equipment and tactics turned every encounter into a one-sided slaughter. The entire operation was completed within hours, leaving the Red Riders in complete control of a village whose surviving inhabitants had been sorted into categories based on their potential value to elven society. The strongest and healthiest adults were selected for transport back to Tirnalia, where they would be trained for various forms of manual labor that elven society required, but that the elder folk themselves found beneath their dignity. Children above a certain age were also marked for capture, as their young minds would be more adaptable to the education and cultural conditioning that would be necessary to transform them into useful servants. The very young, the elderly, and those whose physical condition made them unsuitable for hard labor were eliminated quickly and efficiently, their bodies disposed of in ways that would minimize the risk of disease while also serving as warnings to other communities that might consider resistance. The success of this first operation exceeded even the most optimistic projections that had been developed during the planning phase. The Red Riders had captured over 100 potential slaves while suffering no casualties whatsoever among their own forces. More importantly, they had demonstrated the effectiveness of their tactics and equipment in actual combat conditions, proving that the theoretical advantages they possessed over primitive enemies could be translated into decisive, practical superiority. Word of the raid's success spread quickly through the upper levels of elven society, generating enthusiasm for expanded operations that surprised even King Oberon with its intensity. Nobles who had previously expressed skepticism about the wisdom of interdimensional expansion now competed with each other to provide resources and support for future expeditions. Scholars who had devoted their careers to abstract philosophical questions suddenly developed intense interest in the practical challenges of managing large populations of enslaved aliens. The captured humans were processed and integrated into elven society with the same systematic efficiency that characterized everything the Ainel attempted. Those selected for manual labor were assigned to construction projects, mining operations, and agricultural work that required strength and endurance, but little in the way of specialized skills. Their basic physical needs were met adequately, but they were kept in conditions that made clear their status as property rather than people. The children faced a different fate, one that the Ainel considered far more benevolent, but that was arguably more cruel in its systematic destruction of everything that made them human. They were separated from any surviving adults from their communities and placed in educational institutions where they would be systematically stripped of their original culture and identity. Their native language was forbidden. Their memories of home were actively suppressed through magical and psychological techniques, and they were indoctrinated with a worldview that portrayed their enslavement as a form of salvation. These younger captives were taught to speak Elilon, the language of the elder folk, but they were never permitted to learn to read or write in any tongue. They were given new names chosen by their elven masters, names that bore no resemblance to anything from their original culture. Most importantly of all, they were taught to view their former lives as periods of darkness and ignorance, from which they had been rescued by the wisdom and benevolence of their elven superiors. The psychological conditioning applied to these young slaves was comprehensive and ruthless in its efficiency. Through a combination of magical influence, systematic reward and punishment, and carefully managed social pressure, they were transformed into beings who genuinely believed that serving elven interests was not merely their duty, but their privilege. They competed with each other for the approval of their masters, reported any signs of rebellion or nostalgia among their fellow slaves, and eventually came to view other humans not as members of their own species, but as inferior creatures who had not been fortunate enough to receive elven guidance. The success of this first raid and the effectiveness of the slave processing systems it tested led inevitably to expanded operations on a scale that dwarfed the initial expedition. Within months, multiple Red Rider forces were operating simultaneously in different regions of the target world, conducting raids that gradually stripped entire provinces of their human populations, while accumulating wealth and resources on a scale that exceeded the most optimistic projections of the original planners. The systematic nature of these expanded operations reflected the organizational genius that had allowed the Ainel to rebuild their civilization after the destruction of their homeland. Each raid was planned with meticulous attention to detail, taking into account factors ranging from seasonal weather patterns to the agricultural cycles that determined when human communities would be most vulnerable to attack. Intelligence networks were established to monitor human activities and identify the most profitable targets for future operations. The Red Riders themselves evolved rapidly from a single experimental military unit into a complex organization with specialized divisions trained for different types of operations. Scout units were developed to conduct reconnaissance in alien worlds and identify suitable targets for larger forces. Combat specialists were trained to deal with enemies who possessed significant military capabilities or supernatural defenses. Support units were created to manage the logistical challenges of moving large numbers of captives and quantities of loot across dimensional boundaries. Perhaps most importantly of all, the Ainel developed techniques for managing the psychological impact of their operations on the communities they raided. They understood that terror was their most effective weapon, but they also recognized that terror needed to be applied strategically to achieve maximum effect. Random violence might temporarily paralyze their enemies, but systematic psychological warfare could break the will to resist permanently. The methods they developed for achieving this psychological dominance would eventually become part of the legendary terror associated with what would later be known as the Wild Hunt. They learned to time their raids to coincide with periods when their enemies would be most vulnerable to fear and despair. They developed techniques for creating spectral illusions that made their forces appear larger and more supernatural than they actually were. Most importantly of all, they learned to leave survivors who would spread tales of their encounters, stories that would grow in the telling until the very mention of skeletal riders on black horses could empty entire regions of their populations. The wealth that flowed back to Tir Nalia as a result of these expanded operations transformed elven society in ways that even King Oberon had not anticipated. The city itself underwent a period of unprecedented growth and beautification as resources that had once been scarce became abundant almost overnight. New districts were constructed to house the growing slave population, while existing neighborhoods were enhanced with architectural details and artistic flourishes that reflected the cultural confidence of a people who saw themselves as masters of the multiverse. The social structure of elven society also evolved to accommodate the realities of managing an interdimensional empire built on slave labor. New ranks and titles were created for those who distinguished themselves in the management of raiding operations or the processing of captured populations. Academic institutions were established to study the most effective methods for extracting value from conquered territories, while minimizing the costs of maintaining control over hostile populations. Yet, even as the Ainel celebrated their transformation from refugees to conquerors, even as they congratulated themselves on the establishment of an empire that spanned multiple worlds and seemed destined to expand indefinitely, the seeds of their future transformation were already being planted in the very success they had achieved. The unicorns, those pure-hearted creatures whose abilities had made the dimensional raids possible, were growing increasingly disturbed by the uses to which their powers were being put. They had agreed to assist what they believed would be exploration and peaceful contact with other worlds, not systematic campaigns of enslavement and extermination. Their natural empathy made it impossible for them to remain indifferent to the suffering that the Red Riders were causing in world after world. The breaking point came when a group of unicorns discovered the true fate of the humans who were being brought back through the dimensional portals they maintained. The systematic dehumanization of the captives, the brutal efficiency of the processing centers where children were stripped of their identities and transformed into willing slaves, the casual disposal of those deemed unfit for exploitation. All of this violated every principle that the unicorns held sacred. In an act of rebellion that caught the Ainel completely unprepared, the unicorns suddenly withdrew their cooperation from the interdimensional raiding program. The great portal that connected Tir Nalia to the target worlds snapped shut without warning, trapping several Red Rider units on the far side of dimensional barriers they could no longer cross. Other unicorns used their abilities to seal the smaller portals that had been opened for specific operations, effectively ending the Ainel's ability to conduct large-scale, interdimensional raids. The crisis that followed this unicorn rebellion threatened to destroy everything the Ainel had built through decades of careful planning and systematic exploitation. The flow of slaves and wealth that had fueled their rapid expansion suddenly ceased, leaving them with ongoing obligations and expenses, but no means of meeting them through continued raiding. Worse still, they found themselves cut off from Red Rider forces that were still operating in alien worlds, unable to provide reinforcement or support for warriors who might be facing organized resistance from their increasingly desperate enemies. King Oberon's response to this crisis demonstrated both the resilience that had enabled the Ainel to survive the destruction of their homeland and the adaptability that would allow them to overcome this new challenge. Rather than attempting to force the unicorns back into cooperation through violence or coercion, he authorized a massive research effort aimed at developing alternative methods for interdimensional travel that would not depend on unicorn abilities. The solution, eventually developed by elven scholars and mages, represented a breakthrough in magical theory that rivaled any achievement in their long history. Through techniques that combined traditional portal magic with innovations inspired by their study of the dimensional barriers themselves, they succeeded in creating a new class of specialists known as navigators. These elven mages possessed the ability to create and maintain small-scale portals that could transport limited numbers of individuals across dimensional boundaries without requiring unicorn assistance. The navigator system had significant limitations compared to the massive portals that the unicorns could create and maintain. The gateways they could open were much smaller, limiting the size of raiding parties that could be deployed to other worlds. The portals required constant magical energy to maintain, making long-term operations in alien worlds much more expensive and logistically challenging. Most importantly of all, the navigation techniques required to locate specific target worlds were far more complex and unreliable than the intuitive abilities that unicorns possessed naturally. Yet, despite these limitations, the development of navigator capabilities represented a crucial step in the transformation of the Red Riders from a conventional military organization into something far more mysterious and terrible. The smaller size of the raiding parties they could now deploy forced them to rely much more heavily on stealth, speed, and psychological warfare than on overwhelming force. The increased costs of their operations made it essential for them to maximize the terror they inspired, while minimizing the time and resources required for each raid. Most significantly of all, the unreliability of navigator-created portals meant that the Red Riders could no longer count on being able to retreat quickly to their home dimension when operations went wrong. This new vulnerability forced them to develop alternative survival strategies that would allow them to operate effectively even when cut off from reinforcement or support for extended periods. The solution they developed to this challenge would eventually become the most distinctive and terrifying aspect of their operations in alien worlds. Rather than maintaining a purely physical presence that could be trapped and destroyed by overwhelming enemy forces, the Red Riders learned to project themselves into other dimensions primarily in spectral form, existing as beings that were partially present in the material world but could withdraw into other planes of existence when threatened with destruction. This transition from physical to spectral raiding was not accomplished quickly or easily. It required the development of entirely new magical techniques and the systematic retraining of warriors who had become accustomed to fighting as conventional cavalry. The process of learning to exist simultaneously in multiple dimensions while maintaining combat effectiveness took years to master and demanded a level of magical ability that few elves possessed naturally. Yet the advantages provided by spectral projection proved to be so overwhelming that the effort required to master these techniques was more than justified by the results. Raiders operating in spectral form were effectively immune to most conventional weapons, could pass through solid barriers that would have stopped physical beings, and could appear and disappear at will in ways that made them seem more like supernatural phenomena than mortal enemies. The psychological impact of these spectral raiders on their enemies exceeded even the terror that the original Red Riders had inspired with their skeletal armor and black steeds. Witnesses to spectral raids reported encounters with beings that seemed to exist halfway between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, creatures that could be seen clearly one moment and fade into translucent shadows the next. The inability of conventional weapons to harm these apparitions left their enemies feeling helpless in ways that physical defeat never could. As reports of these encounters spread from world to world, carried by the few survivors of spectral raids and the refugees who fled ahead of rumored attacks, the reputation of the elven raiders began to take on mythological proportions. They were no longer seen as merely dangerous enemies, but as supernatural forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of life and death, creatures that belonged more to nightmare than to waking reality. The transformation in tactics and capabilities necessitated by the Unicorn Rebellion also prompted a change in identity and self-perception that would have profound implications for the future development of the organization. The name Dir Gruadri had been appropriate for a conventional cavalry unit, operating with the support of reliable dimensional portals, but it no longer captured the essential nature of an organization that specialized in spectral raids conducted by warriors who existed partially outside normal reality. The new name, chosen to reflect their evolved capabilities and enhanced reputation, was far more ominous and mysterious than their original designation. No longer would they be known as the Red Riders of the Elder Folk, a name that clearly identified their origins and their relationship to conventional elven society. From this point forward, they would be called the Wild Hunt, a designation that carried within it all the terror and mystery that their spectral operations had inspired in the minds of their enemies. This change in nomenclature represented more than mere rebranding, but reflected a fundamental shift in how the organization saw itself and its place in the cosmos. The Wild Hunt was not bound by the conventional limitations that constrained ordinary military forces, was not limited to operating within the boundaries of normal space and time, was not answerable to the usual moral and ethical considerations that governed the behavior of civilized beings. They had become something unprecedented in the history of any world, a force that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, that could strike anywhere and vanish without trace, that embodied the darkest fears that intelligent beings harbored about the nature of death and the possibility that some things were worse than simple extinction. The age of the Red Riders had ended, and the era of the Wild Hunt had begun. The transformation of the Dir Gruadri into the Wild Hunt marked the beginning of an age unlike anything that had existed in the long history of the multiverse, a time when the boundary between legend and reality became as permeable as the dimensional barriers through which the spectral riders now moved with ethereal grace. The limitations imposed by their reliance on navigator-created portals, rather than weakening their operations, had forced them to evolve into something far more terrifying and mysterious than they had ever been as conventional cavalry. The smaller raiding parties that the restricted portal sizes necessitated could no longer rely on overwhelming force to achieve their objectives, but they discovered that they no longer needed such crude methods when they could inspire terror that transcended the merely physical. A dozen spectral riders appearing from the mists of an early winter morning could empty entire valleys of their populations through fear alone, their reputation having grown to the point where the mere suggestion of their presence was enough to send communities fleeing toward whatever sanctuary they could find. The seasonal patterns that emerged from these new operational constraints became one of the most distinctive and dreaded aspects of the Wild Hunt's activities across the various worlds they now visited. The navigator magic that enabled their interdimensional travel was most effective during the winter months, when the barriers between worlds grew thin and the mystical energies required for portal creation flowed more freely through the cosmic void that separated different planes of existence. This seasonal limitation initially appeared to be another disadvantage that would restrict their operational flexibility, but the Wild Hunt discovered that winter raids offered psychological advantages that more than compensated for the reduced frequency of their operations. The cold months were already associated with death and hardship in most of the worlds they visited, times when communities turned inward and prepared to endure the lean seasons through careful rationing of resources and mutual support. The appearance of spectral riders during these vulnerable periods struck at fears that ran deeper than conscious thought, touching primal anxieties about darkness and cold, and the possibility that winter might last forever. Communities that might have organized effective resistance during the abundance of summer found themselves paralyzed by despair when the skeletal forms of the wild hunt materialized from snowstorms and freezing fogs. The winter raids typically lasted for months, rather than the quick strikes that had characterized their earlier operations, with the spectral riders maintaining a ghostly presence that haunted entire regions throughout the coldest parts of the year. They would appear and disappear unpredictably, sometimes manifesting in solid form to conduct actual captures and killings, sometimes existing as half-seen shadows that might or might not represent genuine threats. This extended presence created a state of psychological siege that proved far more effective than conventional military tactics in breaking the will of their enemies. Communities under the influence of a winter-long wild hunt visitation found it impossible to maintain normal social functions when no one could be certain whether the shapes they glimpsed moving through blizzards were natural phenomena or harbingers of death and enslavement. The spectral nature of their new operational methods allowed the wild hunt to project illusions and create apparitions that magnified their apparent numbers far beyond their actual strength. Witnesses to their raids reported encounters with vast armies of skeletal warriors mounted on steeds that seemed to gallop across the sky itself, leaving trails of frost and shadow in their wake. These accounts were not entirely inaccurate, for the hunt had learned to use the dimensional barriers themselves as weapons, creating echoes and reflections that multiplied their image across multiple planes of existence simultaneously. The most terrifying aspect of these spectral manifestations was their apparent ability to exist in states that defied normal understanding of life and death. The riders seemed to flicker between corporeal and ethereal existence, solid enough to wield weapons and capture prisoners one moment, translucent as morning mist the next. Their mounts displayed the same impossible duality, appearing sometimes as ordinary horses, albeit ones of supernatural size and darkness, sometimes as creatures with too many legs or eyes that burned with unnatural fire. These shape-shifting abilities were not mere illusion, but represented a genuine mastery of dimensional manipulation that allowed the wild hunt to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being. They had learned to anchor their consciousness in the spectral realm, while projecting physical manifestations into whatever world they were visiting, creating a form of existence that was neither fully alive nor completely dead, but something altogether more mysterious and terrible. The psychological impact of encounters with beings who seemed to exist outside the normal categories that defined reality was devastating to populations who had no framework for understanding what they were witnessing. Religious leaders struggled to explain whether the wild hunt represented demons from some underworld, angels of divine judgment, or something else entirely that fell outside their theological understanding. Scholars and philosophers found their rational worldviews challenged by phenomena that seemed to violate every natural law they had previously accepted as immutable. The cultural impact of the wild hunt's operations extended far beyond the immediate victims of their raids, rippling outward through oral traditions and folk memories until their influence had touched virtually every civilization in the worlds they visited. Each culture interpreted their encounters according to its own mythological framework, but certain common elements appeared in stories told from the frozen wastes of northern realms to the sun-baked deserts of southern continents. In the island chains known as Skellige, where seafaring peoples had developed traditions that emphasized courage in the face of overwhelming odds, the wild hunt became incorporated into their most fundamental beliefs about the nature of existence itself. Here they were known as the Wraiths of Morhog, supernatural beings whose appearance heralded not merely danger to individuals or communities, but the approach of Ragnarok itself, the end of the world and all things in it. The Skellige interpretation of the Wild Hunt differed significantly from the fearful legends that had developed in other parts of the world. For these island warriors saw the spectral riders not as arbitrary forces of evil, but as harbingers of a cosmic cycle that was both inevitable and necessary. In their understanding, the world moved through great ages of creation and destruction, and the Wild Hunt's appearance marked the transition from one cycle to the next. This philosophical framework allowed the Skellige peoples to face the threat of the Wild Hunt with a stoicism that impressed even those spectral warriors who had become accustomed to inspiring panic and despair wherever they appeared. Rather than fleeing or attempting to hide when signs of the hunt's approach became apparent, many Skellige communities would gather their warriors and prepare for battle, viewing the encounter as an opportunity to die gloriously rather than as a catastrophe to be avoided. The ship that sometimes accompanied the Wild Hunt's operations became the subject of particularly elaborate legends among the Skellige peoples. This vessel, known to the Ainel as the Naglfar, appeared to those who witnessed it as a craft that sailed through the sky as easily as across water, its hull gleaming with an unnatural light that seemed to draw darkness toward it rather than dispelling it. Skellige mythology held that this supernatural ship was constructed from the fingernails and toenails of the dead, materials that possessed special significance in their culture's understanding of the boundary between life and death. This belief led to the development of elaborate funeral rituals, in which the nails of the deceased were carefully removed and disposed of, in ways that would prevent their use in the construction of vessels that could carry the dead back to plague the living. The practice of nail removal from corpses spread throughout Skellige culture and eventually to other regions that had been influenced by their maritime traditions, creating a cultural phenomenon that persisted long after the original reasons for the practice had been forgotten. In coastal communities throughout the northern seas, it became customary to trim the nails of the dead, not because anyone remembered the connection to the Wild Hunt, but because tradition demanded it, and tradition was not lightly abandoned. The mainland cultures that encountered the Wild Hunt developed their own interpretations and defensive practices, though few achieved the philosophical acceptance that characterized the Skellige response. In most regions, the spectral riders were viewed as an unmitigated evil, a supernatural plague that struck without warning and left only death and emptiness in its wake. The timing of Wild Hunt appearances during the harshest months of winter led many cultures to associate them with natural phenomena that accompanied the coldest seasons. Some believed that the riders were personifications of winter itself, supernatural embodiments of the killing frost that destroyed crops and froze rivers solid. Others saw them as harbingers of particularly severe winters, their appearance serving as a warning that the coming months would bring hardships beyond the normal seasonal challenges. These interpretations often led to the development of apotropaic rituals designed to ward off both the Wild Hunt and the excessive cold they were believed to herald. Communities would gather at the first signs of winter to perform ceremonies intended to appease whatever forces controlled the spectral riders, offering sacrifices and conducting elaborate prayers that sometimes continued for days or weeks. The irony of these defensive rituals was that they often made communities more vulnerable to actual Wild Hunt raids by concentrating populations in predictable locations during precisely the seasons when the spectral riders were most active. The INL learned to time their operations to coincide with these gatherings, using the humans' own protective ceremonies as opportunities to capture large numbers of victims who had conveniently assembled themselves for easy harvesting. Yet not all encounters with the Wild Hunt ended in tragedy for the mortal populations they visited. The spectral nature of their existence meant that their raids were not always entirely successful, particularly when they encountered individuals or communities that possessed unusual courage or spiritual strength. Some witnesses reported sightings of the hunt that resulted in no apparent harm, as if the spectral riders had appeared, evaluated the situation, and decided to withdraw without taking any action. These peaceful encounters gave rise to legends about the wild hunt that differed markedly from the tales of terror and destruction that characterized most accounts of their activities. In some traditions, they were seen as psychopomps, supernatural guides who appeared to escort the souls of the dead to whatever afterlife awaited them. In others, they were viewed as harbingers of change, who announced the end of one era and the beginning of another without necessarily bringing destruction. The scholarly attempts to study and understand the wild hunt represented one of the most ambitious intellectual undertakings in the history of several worlds, though these efforts were severely hampered by the dangerous and unpredictable nature of their subject matter. The School of the Viper, an organization of scholars and monster hunters that had established itself in one of the worlds frequently visited by the spectral riders, devoted enormous resources to collecting and analyzing every available account of wild hunt encounters. Their library, housed in a fortress monastery that had been constructed specifically to serve as a research center, eventually contained thousands of documents related to the wild hunt phenomenon. These included first-hand accounts from survivors of raids, scholarly analyses of the spectral riders' apparent abilities and limitations, theoretical treatises on the nature of interdimensional travel, and detailed studies of the cultural impact that hunt appearances had on affected communities. The scholars of the Viper School approached their study of the wild hunt with the same systematic methodology they applied to other supernatural phenomena, attempting to identify patterns and weaknesses that could be exploited by those who found themselves targeted by the spectral raiders. They developed detailed classifications of the different types of manifestations associated with hunt appearances, created maps showing the geographic and temporal patterns of raids, and even experimented with various magical and alchemical preparations that might provide protection against spectral attacks. Their research yielded insights that would have been invaluable to communities threatened by the wild hunt, but the dissolution of the school before their work could be widely disseminated meant that most of their accumulated knowledge was lost when their libraries were abandoned and scattered. The scholars who had devoted their careers to understanding the spectral riders found themselves forced to flee when political upheavals made their research impossible to continue, leaving behind centuries of careful observation and analysis. The few fragments of their work that survived provided tantalizing glimpses of the true nature of the wild hunt, including theoretical frameworks that came remarkably close to understanding the dimensional manipulation techniques that made their operations possible. Some documents suggested that the scholars had begun to develop countermeasures that might have significantly reduced the effectiveness of spectral raids, but these defensive innovations were never tested on a large scale. The abandonment of systematic scholarly research into the wild hunt phenomenon left the various mortal populations to develop their own understanding of the spectral raiders based on incomplete information and cultural interpretation. This led to the gradual transformation of the wild hunt from a genuine interdimensional threat into something approaching pure mythology, a process that served the Ainel's purposes by making it more difficult for their enemies to develop effective countermeasures. The testimonies of those few individuals who managed to escape from wild hunt captivity provided some of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of what lay behind the spectral manifestations that most people witnessed. These survivors described being transported to what appeared to be an entirely different world, one where the familiar laws of physics and time seemed to operate according to different principles entirely. The realm to which captives were taken was described as a place of impossible beauty and subtle horror, where magnificent architecture coexisted with casual cruelty on a scale that challenged human comprehension. The buildings were said to be constructed from materials that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, while gardens of extraordinary loveliness surrounded structures where unspeakable experiments were conducted on captured beings from dozens of different worlds. Most disturbing of all were the accounts of temporal distortion that seemed to affect anyone transported to the Ainel homeland. Captives who believed they had been imprisoned for days or weeks would return to find that years or even decades had passed in the worlds from which they had been taken. Family members they had left behind would have aged into old age or died entirely, while communities they remembered would have been transformed beyond recognition by the passage of time. These temporal effects were not merely byproducts of interdimensional travel, but appeared to be deliberately maintained as part of the psychological warfare that the Wild Hunt employed against their enemies. Survivors who returned to their homeworlds carrying tales of brief captivity that had somehow lasted for lifetimes created a form of existential terror that went beyond simple fear of death or enslavement. The knowledge that capture by the Wild Hunt might result not merely in personal suffering, but in the effective loss of everything and everyone a person cared about, created a despair that was far more damaging to community morale than conventional threats could achieve. Parents lived in constant fear that their children might be taken, not because they would suffer, but because they might return decades later to find their families long dead and their entire world changed beyond recognition. This temporal displacement also served practical purposes for the Ainel by making it difficult for escaped captives to provide useful intelligence about Wild Hunt operations or capabilities. Information that might have been accurate when a prisoner was first captured could be completely obsolete by the time they managed to return to their home dimension, leaving their testimony useful primarily for inspiring fear rather than enabling effective resistance. The gradual transformation of Wild Hunt accounts from contemporary threats to ancient legends was accelerated by the natural tendency of oral traditions to embellish and modify stories with each retelling. Details that might have provided useful tactical information were replaced with supernatural elements that made the accounts more entertaining but less accurate, while the genuine interdimensional nature of the threat was obscured by mythological frameworks that portrayed the spectral riders as manifestations of natural forces or divine judgment. This mythologization process was aided by the Wild Hunt's own preference for maintaining their mysterious reputation rather than allowing their true nature to become widely understood. They actively encouraged the development of legends that portrayed them as supernatural forces beyond mortal comprehension, using various techniques to ensure that witnesses to their raids would remember encounters in ways that emphasized their otherworldly aspects while obscuring the practical details of their operations. The use of illusion and spectral projection in their raids was calibrated to create memories that would seem dreamlike and unreal when survivors attempted to describe them to others. The psychological impact of encountering beings who appeared to exist simultaneously in multiple states of reality left witnesses questioning their own perceptions, making it difficult for them to provide coherent accounts that others would take seriously. Over time, this deliberate cultivation of mythological status achieved exactly what the Wild Hunt intended. Communities that might have organized effective resistance against a clearly understood enemy instead developed elaborate rituals and superstitions designed to ward off supernatural forces that they believed operated according to rules that mortal minds could never fully comprehend. The seasonal nature of Wild Hunt operations contributed to their gradual integration into the natural cycles that governed agricultural and social life in many of the worlds they visited. Communities learned to expect their appearance during the darkest months of winter, planning their activities around the assumption that certain periods would be too dangerous for travel or outdoor work. This seasonal integration created a form of accommodation that served the Wild Hunt's purposes while allowing mortal populations to maintain some semblance of normal life during the periods when the spectral riders were not active. Communities developed strategies for surviving winter months that took into account the possibility of wild hunt encounters, stockpiling resources in hidden locations, and establishing emergency procedures for responding to spectral manifestations. The result was a form of coexistence that was deeply asymmetrical but sustainable over long periods. The Wild Hunt obtained the captives and resources they required for their interdimensional empire, while allowing enough of the mortal population to survive and reproduce that their hunting grounds remained viable for future operations. The mortal communities, meanwhile, adapted to living under the constant threat of spectral raids, while maintaining enough autonomy during non-winter months to preserve their cultural identities. This balance between exploitation and preservation reflected a sophisticated understanding of resource management that distinguished the Wild Hunt from simpler predatory organizations. They had learned to view the mortal populations they raided, not as enemies to be destroyed, but as renewable resources to be harvested sustainably, ensuring that their interdimensional empire could continue operating indefinitely without exhausting the sources of wealth and labor that sustained it. The development of this sustainable exploitation model marked the final transformation of the organization from its origins as a conventional military unit into something entirely unprecedented in the history of the multiverse. The Wild Hunt had become a force of nature in the truest sense, an integral part of the cosmic order that shaped the development of civilizations across multiple worlds while remaining forever separate from and superior to the mortal populations they preyed upon. Yet even as they achieved this position of seemingly unassailable power and influence, even as they congratulated themselves on having transcended the limitations that constrained lesser beings to single worlds and finite lifespans, the seeds of change were already beginning to sprout in dimensions they had not yet learned to perceive. The multiverse was vast and full of surprises, and somewhere among the countless worlds that lay beyond their current reach, forces were stirring that would eventually challenge their dominion in ways they could never have anticipated. The age of the Wild Hunt's unchallenged supremacy was approaching its zenith. But like all things that rise to great heights, it was already beginning to cast shadows that pointed toward its eventual transformation. The spectral riders, who had learned to exist between life and death, between reality and dream, between past and future, would soon discover that some boundaries cannot be crossed without fundamental changes to the nature of those who dare to traverse them. The winter of their power stretched across multiple worlds and countless years. But even the longest winter must eventually give way to spring. And when that season of change finally arrived, it would bring with it consequences that would reshape not only the Wild Hunt itself, but the entire structure of the multiverse they had come to regard as their hunting ground. In the magnificent halls of Tirnalia, where the crystalline spires caught the light of dying stars and transformed it into patterns that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension, a subtle but profound transformation was taking place in the very heart of the Ainel's interdimensional empire. King Oberon Muirsetach, who had ruled for over 7 centuries, and whose vision had transformed his people from refugees into masters of countless worlds, was slowly withdrawing from the responsibilities and burdens that had once defined his existence. The change was not sudden or dramatic, for nothing about the elder folk ever proceeded with the haste that characterized shorter-lived races, but it was unmistakable to those who knew how to observe the subtle signs that marked the shifting currents of elven politics. The king's audiences became less frequent, his participation in council meetings more perfunctory, his attention during discussions of policy and strategy increasingly distant and unfocused. Those who had served Oberon for centuries recognized the symptoms of what the Ainel called the Great Weariness, a condition that sometimes afflicted their immortal kind after lifespans that stretched across millennia. It was not precisely depression in the way that shorter-lived races might understand the term, but rather a gradual disconnection from the immediate concerns of existence, a turning inward toward contemplation of mysteries that lay beyond the reach of even elven wisdom. The king would sit for hours in his private chambers, staring out through windows that had been enchanted to show views of distant worlds and alien stars, his expression suggesting that his thoughts had traveled far beyond the boundaries of the physical realm. When addressed directly, he would respond with the courtesy and intelligence that had always characterized his reign, but his words carried an undertone of detachment that made it clear his attention was focused on concerns that his subjects could not share. This withdrawal from active governance created a vacuum of authority that threatened to destabilize the carefully maintained balance of power that had enabled the Ainel to manage their interdimensional empire effectively. The various noble houses that served the crown began to position themselves for what they anticipated might eventually become a succession crisis, while the bureaucratic apparatus that actually administered their far-flung territories found itself operating with decreasing guidance from the royal court. Into this void stepped Eredin Briac Glass, the general who had led the Wild Hunt through its transformation from conventional cavalry into the most feared interdimensional raiding force in the multiverse. Eredin's position as commander of the Spectral Riders had given him unique insights into the practical challenges of managing an empire that spanned multiple worlds, while his centuries of successful operations had earned him a reputation for competence and reliability that made him a natural choice to assume additional responsibilities. Working closely with him was Avalok, an elven sage whose knowledge of dimensional magic and temporal manipulation had made him indispensable to the Wild Hunt's operations. Where Eredin possessed the military expertise necessary to project elven power across the dimensional barriers, Avalok commanded the theoretical knowledge required to understand and exploit the fundamental forces that governed interdimensional travel and spectral manifestation. The partnership between these two remarkable elves represented a combination of practical experience and scholarly wisdom that was uniquely suited to the challenges of governing an empire that existed simultaneously in multiple realities. Eredin's understanding of logistics and tactical operations complemented Avalok's mastery of the magical principles that made their entire civilization possible, creating a leadership dynamic that could function effectively even without direct royal oversight. As King Oberon's withdrawal from governance became more pronounced, this unofficial partnership gradually evolved into the de facto ruling authority for much of the Ainel's interdimensional activities. Eredin assumed responsibility for military operations and the practical administration of conquered territories, while Avalok focused on the research and development projects that were essential for maintaining their technological advantages over the various mortal populations they exploited. The arrangement worked smoothly for several years, allowing the interdimensional empire to continue expanding and evolving, even as its nominal ruler became increasingly disconnected from the day-to-day realities of governance. The Wild Hunt's operations continued with their characteristic efficiency, while the scholarly institutions that studied dimensional magic and temporal manipulation made steady progress in developing new techniques for exploitation and control. Yet this period of stability and gradual expansion was about to be shattered by an encounter that would transform not only the Wild Hunt's operational priorities, but the fundamental nature of their existence as interdimensional predators. In the year 1267, while conducting routine reconnaissance operations in a world that the Ainel had designated as a potential target for systematic exploitation, the Spectral Riders detected something that would change the course of their history forever. The discovery occurred in a region known as Velen, a war-torn landscape where human conflicts had created the perfect conditions for Wild Hunt operations. The constant warfare had destabilized local governments and scattered populations, making it difficult for communities to organize effective resistance against interdimensional raiders. More importantly, the chaos and suffering that characterized daily life in Velen had created an atmosphere of despair and hopelessness that made the psychological warfare tactics of the Wild Hunt particularly effective. Eredin had dispatched a reconnaissance force to evaluate the potential of this region for a major harvesting operation when his scouts reported detecting magical emanations unlike anything they had previously encountered. The energy signatures they had identified possessed characteristics that seemed familiar yet impossible, resembling the dimensional manipulation abilities of their unicorn slaves, but manifesting from what appeared to be a single human individual rather than one of the pure-hearted creatures whose powers they had been exploiting for centuries. The source of these impossible emanations was a young woman who appeared to be fleeing through the wilderness in a state of considerable distress and confusion. Initial observations suggested that she was nothing more than another human refugee seeking to escape the warfare that had devastated her homeland. But the magical energies surrounding her told a very different story. This individual possessed abilities that should have been impossible for any creature not born of the Elder Folk's ancient bloodlines, capabilities that seemed to transcend the normal limitations that constrained mortal magic users. Eredin himself materialized in spectral form to observe this anomalous human more closely, bringing with him the full authority of the Wild Hunt and the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent studying the various forms of magical ability that existed across the multiverse. What he discovered when he focused his attention on the fleeing girl exceeded even his most optimistic expectations and challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of magical inheritance that had guided Ainel policy for millennia. The young woman possessed what could only be described as elder blood, the legendary magical heritage that had once flowed through the veins of the most powerful among the unicorns, and that the Ainel had always believed to be forever beyond their reach. This was not some diluted or corrupted version of those ancient abilities, but something that appeared to be genuine elder blood in its purest and most powerful form, manifesting in a human individual through some miraculous accident of genetics or divine intervention. The implications of this discovery were so profound that Eredin found himself temporarily paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. For centuries, the INL had accepted that their dependence on unicorn cooperation for dimensional travel was an unavoidable limitation of their interdimensional empire. They had developed the navigator system as a partial solution to this constraint, but they had never dared to hope that they might someday gain direct access to the elder blood abilities that would make their expansion truly limitless. Yet here was a human girl, alone and apparently unaware of her own significance, carrying within her bloodline the very power that could transform the Wild Hunt from interdimensional raiders into masters of space and time itself. If her abilities could be harnessed and incorporated into elven society, either through capture and forced cooperation, or through some more subtle form of manipulation, the ANL would finally possess the means to achieve the unlimited expansion that had always been the ultimate goal of their civilization. The girl herself appeared to be named Cyrilla, though she was also called by the shortened form Ciri, and initial intelligence suggested that she was connected to various political figures in the human kingdoms of this particular world. More detailed investigation revealed that she possessed some form of training in combat and survival skills that exceeded what would be expected from an ordinary human female of her apparent age, suggesting that she had received education and preparation that reflected her unusual importance. Most significantly of all, she appeared to be fleeing from some form of political or military threat that had separated her from whatever guardians or protectors had previously been responsible for her safety. This vulnerability represented an unprecedented opportunity for the Wild Hunt to gain control over an individual whose abilities could revolutionize their entire approach to interdimensional conquest and exploitation. Eredin immediately ordered his reconnaissance forces to maintain constant surveillance of the girl while he developed a strategy for capturing her without alerting whatever other powers might have an interest in her welfare. The operation would need to be conducted with unusual subtlety and care, for the value of what they were attempting to acquire far exceeded anything the Wild Hunt had ever previously attempted to steal from the mortal worlds they raided. The initial approach to capturing Ciri was planned according to the same principles that had made the Wild Hunt successful in countless previous operations, but adapted to account for the unique challenges posed by a target who possessed genuine magical abilities rather than the conventional vulnerabilities of ordinary mortals. Eredin deployed his forces in spectral form to minimize the risk of detection while maximizing the psychological impact of their eventual manifestation. The attack, when it finally came, unfolded with the terrifying precision that had made the Wild Hunt legendary across multiple worlds. The spectral riders materialized from the storm-racked darkness surrounding Ciri like nightmares given physical form, their skeletal armor gleaming with unnatural light while their shadow-dark mounts seemed to gallop across the very air itself. The sight of these otherworldly warriors emerging from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension would have been enough to paralyze most humans with terror and despair. Yet, Ciri proved to be far from defenseless against even the most sophisticated psychological warfare that the Wild Hunt could deploy against her. The elder blood that flowed through her veins provided not only magical abilities, but also a form of spiritual resilience that allowed her to resist the supernatural fear that the spectral riders projected as their primary weapon. Instead of collapsing in terror or attempting futile flight, she demonstrated combat skills and tactical awareness that surprised even Eredin with their effectiveness. More troubling still from the Wild Hunt's perspective was the sudden arrival of additional combatants who appeared to have been tracking Ciri's movements and were prepared to defend her against exactly the kind of supernatural threat that the spectral riders represented. These new arrivals possessed abilities and equipment that suggested they were far from ordinary humans, though they did not appear to be elder folk or any other race that the Ainel had previously encountered. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense, with the Wild Hunt's spectral advantages being neutralized by opponents who seemed to possess both the knowledge necessary to counter their dimensional manipulation techniques and the combat skills required to engage them effectively in direct battle. For the first time in centuries, Eredin found his forces not merely challenged but actually forced to retreat from a battlefield where they should have possessed overwhelming superiority. The failure of this initial capture attempt was deeply disturbing to the Wild Hunt leadership, but it also provided valuable intelligence about both Ciri herself and the nature of the opposition they would face in any future attempts to acquire her. The girl clearly possessed training and support networks that went far beyond what would be expected for an ordinary human refugee, while her defenders demonstrated capabilities that suggested they had specific knowledge of the Wild Hunt and its operational methods. Most importantly of all, the brief engagement had confirmed that Ciri's elder blood abilities were genuine and powerful enough to pose significant challenges to even the most sophisticated elven magic. Her potential value to the Ainel's interdimensional empire was so enormous that Eredin was prepared to commit whatever resources might be necessary to secure her eventual capture, regardless of the obstacles that might stand in his way. The reconnaissance and analysis that followed the failed capture attempt provided Eredin and Avalok with a much clearer understanding of what they were dealing with and what strategies might prove effective in future operations. Ciri was not merely a human with unusual abilities, but appeared to be connected to prophecies and political currents that involved multiple kingdoms and various supernatural forces, making her both more valuable and more dangerous than they had initially realized. The network of protectors and allies that surrounded her included individuals whose capabilities rivaled those of the elder folk themselves. Though their motivations and ultimate objectives remained unclear, some appeared to be motivated by genuine concern for her welfare, while others seemed more interested in exploiting her abilities for their own purposes, creating a complex web of conflicting interests that the Wild Hunt might be able to manipulate to their advantage. The decision to mark Ciri as a priority target for the Wild Hunt represented a fundamental shift in their operational focus that would have profound implications for the development of their interdimensional empire. Previous raids had been conducted primarily for the purpose of acquiring slaves and resources that could enhance elven civilization, but the pursuit of Ciri was motivated by the possibility of gaining abilities that could transform the very nature of their existence. If they could successfully capture her and find some way to harness or transfer her Elder Blood abilities, the Ainel would finally possess the power to achieve the unlimited expansion that had always been the ultimate goal of their civilization. They would no longer be dependent on the cooperation of unicorns or the limitations of navigator magic, but would be able to travel freely between worlds and dimensions according to their own will and desire. The implications of such power were so vast that they challenged the imagination, even of beings whose lifespans stretched across millennia and whose achievements already surpassed anything that shorter-lived races had ever accomplished. With genuine Elder Blood abilities at their disposal, the ANL could establish permanent settlements in the most distant reaches of the multiverse, could explore regions of space and time that had never been accessible to any form of intelligent life, could ultimately achieve a form of existence that transcended the normal limitations of physical reality. The pursuit of such possibilities justified almost any risk or expenditure of resources, making Ciri not merely another target for Wild Hunt operations, but the key to unlocking the ultimate destiny that the Elder Folk had always believed was their birthright. Eredin began immediately to develop long-term strategies for acquiring her that took into account not only her demonstrated abilities and the strength of her protective network, but also the political and military complications that might arise from operations conducted on such an extended scale. The marking of Ciri as a priority target also had immediate implications for the Wild Hunt's relationship with the various mortal populations they had previously treated as nothing more than renewable resources for exploitation. If her abilities were as powerful as initial observations suggested, she might eventually pose a genuine threat to the interdimensional empire itself, making it essential to secure her cooperation or eliminate her as a potential enemy before her powers could develop to their full potential. This marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Wild Hunt, one characterized by focused pursuit of a single individual rather than the broad-spectrum raiding operations that had previously defined their activities. The spectral riders who had once appeared randomly across multiple worlds now began to concentrate their efforts on tracking Ciri's movements and identifying opportunities to separate her from her protectors. The transformation from generalized predators to focused hunters required significant adjustments in both tactics and resource allocation, but it also created new possibilities for achieving objectives that had previously seemed impossible. By concentrating their full attention and capabilities on a single target, the Wild Hunt could bring to bear forms of pressure and manipulation that would have been impractical for broader operations. Yet, even as Eredin congratulated himself on having identified the key to achieving the ultimate expansion of elven power, even as he began to envision a future in which the Wild Hunt possessed abilities that would make them masters of the entire multiverse, other forces were already moving in response to his actions. The failed capture attempt in Velen had not gone unnoticed by those who had interests in Ciri's welfare. and the Wild Hunt's new focus on acquiring her abilities would inevitably bring them into conflict with opponents far more dangerous than any they had previously encountered. The age of unlimited expansion across defenseless worlds was about to give way to a period of genuine conflict against enemies who possessed both the knowledge necessary to understand the true nature of the Wild Hunt and the power required to challenge their supremacy. The spectral riders, who had grown accustomed to inspiring terror and despair wherever they appeared, were about to discover that some quarry possessed the courage and capability to hunt the hunters themselves. The pursuit of Ciri would ultimately reshape not only the Wild Hunt's operational priorities, but the fundamental nature of their existence as interdimensional predators. The girl whose elder blood had seemed to offer unlimited possibilities for expansion would prove to be the catalyst for transformations that none of them could have anticipated, changes that would challenge every assumption about power and destiny that had guided the Ainel since their flight from their dying homeworld centuries earlier. The seeds of both triumph and tragedy had been planted in that storm-swept wilderness in Velen, and the harvest they would eventually yield would transform the Wild Hunt from masters of the multiverse into something altogether different and far more dangerous than even they could imagine. The crystalline towers of Tir Nalia had stood against the star-swept skies of the Ainel homeland for over a millennium, their impossible geometries defying the conventional understanding of architecture while serving as monuments to the triumph of elven will over the chaos of the multiverse. Yet even as these magnificent spires reached ever higher toward the celestial vault, even as they caught and reflected the light of distant suns in patterns that spoke of eternal dominance, shadows were gathering at the very foundations of the world that had become the seat of the Wild Hunt's interdimensional empire. King Oberon Mursatach, whose withdrawal from active governance had created the vacuum of authority that Eredin and Avalach had moved to fill, remained physically present in his palace, but had become increasingly detached from the practical concerns that governed the daily administration of their far-flung territories. The great weariness that afflicted him was deepening with each passing season, transforming him from an active monarch into something more resembling a living statue that occupied the throne without truly ruling from it. This progressive disconnection from the responsibilities of leadership might have been manageable under normal circumstances, for the Ainel had developed governmental structures that could function effectively even when their nominal ruler was temporarily incapacitated by the psychological burdens that sometimes accompanied extreme longevity. The bureaucratic apparatus that actually administered their interdimensional empire had operated with considerable autonomy for centuries, while the noble houses that served the crown had long experience in managing their own territories without constant royal oversight. Yet the circumstances facing the INL were far from normal, and the challenges they now confronted would have tested even the most engaged and capable ruler. The pursuit of Ciri and her elder blood abilities had introduced new complexities into their strategic planning that went far beyond the relatively straightforward logistics of conventional raiding operations. More troubling still, intelligence reports were beginning to suggest that their interdimensional empire itself might be facing threats that transcended anything they had previously been forced to confront. The most immediate and pressing of these threats was emerging not from any external enemy, but from the very world that had served as their sanctuary and stronghold for over 1,000 years. The realm that the Ainel had claimed after fleeing the destruction of their original homeworld was beginning to show signs of the same cosmic plague that had driven them into dimensional exile in the first place. Symptoms that suggested the White Frost had somehow followed them across the barriers of space and time. The White Frost was not merely cold in the way that shorter-lived races might understand the term, but something far more fundamental and terrible, a cosmic phenomenon that drained the very essence of life from whatever it touched. transforming vibrant worlds into crystalline wastelands where nothing could survive or flourish. It moved with the inexorable patience of geological time, advancing across landscapes and continents at a pace that made it difficult to detect until the transformation was already irreversible. The first signs of its presence in the Ainel homeland were subtle enough that they might have been dismissed as natural variations in climate or seasonal patterns, but the scholars and mages who specialized in studying cosmic phenomena recognized the symptoms with a clarity that filled them with existential dread. The winter seasons were lasting longer than they should have, while the summers were growing progressively cooler and shorter. More ominously, the northern regions of their realm were beginning to show the telltale crystalline formations that marked the White Frost's inexorable advance. The discovery that their sanctuary world was not immune to the cosmic plague that had destroyed their original homeland created a crisis that challenged every assumption upon which Ain-El civilization had been built. They had believed that their mastery of dimensional travel would allow them to remain always one step ahead of the White Frost, fleeing from world to world as necessary while maintaining their cultural and technological achievements across multiple realms simultaneously. Yet, the appearance of the phenomenon in their current stronghold suggested that their understanding of its nature and capabilities had been fundamentally flawed. The White Frost was not merely a cosmic accident that affected individual worlds at random, but something that seemed to follow or pursue certain forms of civilization, possibly drawn by the same technological and magical achievements that the Ain-El considered proof of their superiority over lesser races. If this interpretation was correct, then dimensional flight would provide no permanent escape from the threat, for the White Frost would eventually follow them to whatever new world they chose as their next sanctuary. The only alternatives would be to find some way to stop or destroy the cosmic phenomenon entirely, or to achieve a form of existence that transcended the physical limitations that made them vulnerable to its effects in the first place. The scholars and mages who studied the White Frost's advance developed several theoretical frameworks for understanding and potentially combating the phenomenon, though none of these offered immediate solutions to the existential crisis facing their civilization. Some proposed that the cosmic plague was a natural force that could be deflected or contained through sufficiently advanced magical engineering, while others suggested that it might be a conscious entity that could potentially be negotiated with or placated through appropriate offerings. Most intriguingly, a small group of researchers proposed that the White Frost might actually be harnessed and controlled rather than simply endured or fled from, transformed from a threat to their civilization into a weapon that could be deployed against their enemies. This approach would require magical and technological capabilities that exceeded anything the Ain-El had previously achieved, but the potential benefits would be correspondingly vast. If they could learn to control and direct the White Frost's power, the Ain-El would possess a weapon of unprecedented destructive capability, one that could eliminate entire worlds and civilizations without requiring the complex logistics and extended operations that characterize their current raiding activities. More importantly, such mastery would demonstrate their fundamental superiority over the cosmic forces that had previously constrained their expansion, establishing them as beings who had transcended the normal limitations of physical existence. The research program that developed around this possibility represented one of the most ambitious magical undertakings in the history of their civilization, consuming resources and expertise that might otherwise have been devoted to expanding their interdimensional empire or developing new techniques for exploiting conquered territories. Teams of their finest scholars worked in carefully shielded laboratories to study samples of White Frost phenomena, while experimental stations were established at the advancing edge of the cosmic plague to monitor its behavior and test potential countermeasures. The initial results of this research were promising enough to justify continued investment despite the enormous costs involved. The INL discovered that while they could not stop or reverse the White Frost's advance, they could slow its progression in specific areas through careful application of dimensional manipulation techniques. More significantly, they learned to extract and concentrate small quantities of the phenomenon's essential nature, creating what amounted to weaponized samples that could be deployed in combat situations. These concentrated White Frost weapons proved to be devastatingly effective against any enemy that relied on conventional physical existence for survival. Contact with even microscopic quantities of the weaponized phenomenon would begin the same crystallization process that characterized the cosmic plague's natural advance, freezing enemies in place while simultaneously draining the life force that animated their bodies. The psychological impact of these weapons on mortal enemies exceeded even the terror that the Wild Hunt's spectral manifestations had previously inspired. Witnesses to White Frost attacks described seeing their companions transformed into living ice sculptures that retained the appearance of life while being drained of everything that made existence meaningful. The victims remained conscious during the initial stages of the crystallization process, aware of what was happening to them but powerless to resist or escape their fate. The integration of White Frost weapons into the Wild Hunt's operational capabilities transformed them from interdimensional raiders into something approaching a cosmic force of nature, beings who could deploy the same phenomenon that destroyed entire worlds as a tactical weapon in individual combat encounters. The sight of spectral riders wielding the power of cosmic destruction created legends that spread far beyond the worlds they directly targeted, establishing their reputation as harbingers of endings on a scale that transcended individual lives or civilizations. Yet, even as the Ainel celebrated their success in weaponizing the cosmic phenomenon that had once driven them into exile, even as they congratulated themselves on having transformed a threat into an advantage, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. The White Frost continued its inexorable advance across their homeland, consuming territories and resources that had taken centuries to develop while forcing the gradual evacuation of settlements that had stood since the early days of their dimensional empire. The weaponization program had provided them with powerful new tools for conducting raids and eliminating resistance, but it had not addressed the underlying crisis that threatened the continued existence of their civilization in its current form. If anything, their research into the phenomenon had revealed that its advance was accelerating, suggesting that their attempts to harness its power might actually be encouraging its spread rather than containing it. This realization created a sense of urgency that had been absent from Ainel's strategic planning since the early centuries after their flight from their original homeworld. They were no longer operating from a position of unassailable security, planning the gradual expansion of their interdimensional empire at their own pace and according to their own preferences. Instead, they were racing against time to achieve objectives that might provide escape routes or defensive capabilities before the White Frost consumed the foundation of their entire civilization. The pursuit of Ciri and her Elder Blood abilities took on new significance in this context, for her powers might provide exactly the kind of transcendent capabilities that would allow the ANL to survive the destruction of their physical strongholds. If they could harness her dimensional manipulation abilities, they might be able to establish forms of existence that were independent of any specific world or physical location, becoming truly interdimensional beings rather than simply raiders who traveled between conventional realms. This possibility transformed the Wild Hunt's operational priorities in ways that had profound implications for both their tactical methods and their strategic objectives. The careful, patient approach that had characterized their previous raiding activities was replaced by an urgency that reflected their growing desperation to acquire capabilities that might ensure their survival. Resources that had previously been distributed across multiple operations were concentrated on the single objective of capturing and controlling Ciri, while secondary targets were abandoned or relegated to lower priority status. The concentration of effort and resources on a single objective created new possibilities for achieving results that had previously seemed impossible, but it also created new vulnerabilities that their enemies might be able to exploit. The Wild Hunt's reputation had been built on their ability to strike unpredictably across multiple worlds simultaneously, making it impossible for any potential resistance to prepare adequate defenses or organize effective counterattacks. By focusing their attention on a single target, they were abandoning the strategic advantages that had made them nearly invulnerable to retaliation, while potentially providing their enemies with opportunities to predict and counter their operations. The risks involved in this strategic transformation were considerable, but the potential rewards were correspondingly vast, making it a calculated gamble that reflected both the desperation of their situation and their confidence in their superior capabilities. The operational modifications required to support this new strategic focus included significant changes in both personnel allocation and resource distribution that affected every aspect of the Wild Hunt's activities. Reconnaissance forces that had previously been scattered across dozens of different worlds were concentrated on tracking Ciri's movements and identifying patterns in her behavior that might reveal vulnerabilities or opportunities for capture. Combat units that had specialized in different types of raiding operations were retrained and re-equipped for the specific challenges of pursuing a target who possessed genuine Elder Blood abilities and was protected by opponents whose capabilities rivaled those of the Ainel themselves. Support services that had developed around the logistics of managing multiple simultaneous operations were reorganized to provide maximum effectiveness for extended campaigns focused on a single individual. Most significantly, the Wild Hunt began to incorporate new types of personnel and equipment, specifically designed to counter the magical abilities and defensive measures they expected to encounter in their pursuit of Ciri. The integration of White Frost weapons into their standard arsenal was accompanied by the development of new tactical doctrines that emphasized overwhelming force, applied with precision timing rather than the psychological warfare that had previously been their primary weapon. The creatures that accompanied the Wild Hunt on their raids also evolved to reflect their changing operational requirements. The spectral hounds that had served as shock troops in their earlier campaigns were enhanced with White Frost infusions that made their attacks capable of inflicting the same crystallization effects as the weaponized cosmic phenomenon. These enhanced creatures could freeze enemies in place with their breath, making capture operations far more efficient while simultaneously providing additional layers of psychological intimidation. The sight of ethereal wolves breathing clouds of cosmic frost that could transform living beings into ice sculptures created terror that exceeded even the supernatural dread that the Wild Hunt had previously inspired in their enemies. Witnesses to attacks by these enhanced creatures described encounters that seemed to blend the worst aspects of natural predation with cosmic horror, as if the fundamental forces that govern the universe itself had been turned against the basic principles that made life possible. Yet, even as the Wild Hunt evolved to meet the challenges of pursuing Ciri and adapted their capabilities to incorporate the cosmic power they had learned to harness, the fundamental instability of their situation continued to worsen. King Oberon's withdrawal from active leadership had created a power vacuum that was beginning to affect the broader governance of their interdimensional empire, while the advance of the White Frost across their homeland was forcing difficult decisions about which territories and resources could be preserved and which would have to be abandoned. Most troublingly, intelligence reports suggested that their focused pursuit of Ciri was attracting attention from other powers within the multiverse, entities whose capabilities and motivations remained unclear, but whose interest in the same individual who represented the key to Ainel's survival was deeply concerning. The Wild Hunt had grown accustomed to operating as the most powerful predatory force in any dimension they chose to enter, but they were beginning to encounter signs that they might not be alone in their mastery of interdimensional travel and spectral manipulation. The possibility that other beings possessed capabilities comparable to their own created strategic complications that challenged fundamental assumptions about their position within the cosmic order. If they were not unique in their mastery of dimensional magic and spectral warfare, then their entire approach to expansion and conquest might need to be reconsidered to account for potential competitors or enemies who could match their most sophisticated capabilities. The emergence of these new concerns coincided with the discovery that Avalak, whose scholarly expertise had made him indispensable to the Wild Hunt's evolution, and whose partnership with Eredin had provided effective leadership during King Oberon's withdrawal, was developing his own agenda regarding the pursuit of Ciri that did not necessarily align with the broader objectives of Ain-El civilization. Avalak's deep study of elder blood phenomena and dimensional magic had convinced him that the key to transcending the limitations that constrained even the Ain-El lay not in conquest or domination, but in understanding, cooperation. His research suggested that Ciri's abilities could not be simply stolen or transferred, but would need to be freely given or carefully cultivated through methods that respected the fundamental nature of elder blood magic. This philosophical disagreement with Eredin's more direct approach to acquiring Ciri's cooperation created tensions within the Wild Hunt's leadership that threatened to undermine the effectiveness of their operations. Where Eredin favored overwhelming force applied with surgical precision to break down whatever resistance protected their target, Avalak advocated for subtler methods that might take longer to achieve results but would be more likely to preserve the willing cooperation that elder blood magic seemed to require. The debate between these two approaches reflected deeper questions about the nature of power and the most effective methods for achieving transcendence that had philosophical implications extending far beyond the immediate tactical considerations involved in capturing a single individual. Yet with the white frost advancing inexorably across their homeland and time running out for achieving any solution to their existential crisis, such philosophical refinements seemed like luxuries they could not afford. The resolution of this leadership crisis would ultimately determine not only the Wild Hunt's approach to pursuing Ciri, but the fundamental direction of Ain-El civilization as it faced the greatest challenge in its long history. The choices made in the coming months would echo across dimensions and centuries, shaping the destiny of an entire race while determining whether the cosmic phenomenon that had once driven them into exile would ultimately prove to be their salvation or their final destruction. The winter of their discontent was deepening into something that might prove to be eternal, and the spectral riders who had once seemed masters of time and space were discovering that some forces transcend even the most sophisticated understanding of cosmic law. The hunt for elder blood had begun as a quest for ultimate power, but it was rapidly transforming into a desperate race for survival, against odds that even immortal beings might find impossible to overcome. The philosophical disagreement between Eredin and Avalak regarding the most effective approach to acquiring Ciri's elder blood abilities reflected deeper tensions within the Wild Hunt's command structure that had been building for decades, tensions that were now approaching a crisis point as the urgency of their situation intensified with each passing season. While both elven leaders recognized the critical importance of securing Ciri's cooperation for the survival of their civilization, their fundamental disagreement about methods threatened to paralyze the very operations that represented their last hope for transcending the limitations that bound them to worlds vulnerable to the White Frost's inexorable advance. Eredin's approach embodied the martial traditions that had defined the Wild Hunt since its transformation from conventional cavalry into interdimensional raiders, emphasizing overwhelming force applied with surgical precision to achieve clearly defined tactical objectives. In his view, Ciri was ultimately just another target for capture and exploitation, albeit one whose value far exceeded anything they had previously attempted to acquire. Her elder blood abilities made her more dangerous than ordinary prisoners, and her protective network more formidable than typical resistance. But these factors simply required adjustments in tactics and resource allocation, rather than fundamental changes in operational philosophy. The general's strategic planning assumed that sufficient pressure, applied through the right combination of psychological warfare and direct assault, would eventually break down whatever defenses protected Ciri, creating opportunities for capture that could be exploited through conventional means. Once she was physically in their possession, her cooperation could be secured through the same methods that had proven effective with countless other prisoners over the centuries, combining strategic applications of pain and pleasure with magical conditioning techniques that could reshape personality and motivation according to their needs. Avalaksh's alternative approach reflected his deeper understanding of the magical principles that governed elder blood phenomena, principles that suggested such abilities could not be simply stolen or transferred through conventional coercion. His research had convinced him that elder blood magic was fundamentally different from other forms of supernatural power, operating according to laws that prioritized consent and emotional resonance over mere technical mastery or raw magical strength. The sage's growing expertise in temporal manipulation and dimensional theory had revealed patterns in the behavior of elder blood that suggested its wielders possessed a form of cosmic significance that transcended their individual existence, making them integral parts of larger patterns that governed the flow of fate and causality across multiple dimensions. Attempting to force such beings into unwilling cooperation might not merely fail, but could actually disrupt the fundamental forces that made their abilities possible, rendering them useless for the very purposes that the Ain-El hoped to achieve. This philosophical divide between force and persuasion might have remained an academic disagreement under normal circumstances, but the advancing White Frost and King Oberon's continued withdrawal from active leadership had created conditions where strategic unity was essential for survival. The resources and attention that should have been focused entirely on pursuing Ciri were instead being dispersed across competing approaches that weakened both methods, while providing neither with the concentrated support necessary for success. The resolution of this leadership crisis came not through rational debate or political maneuvering, but through developments in Ciri's own situation that created new opportunities for direct action. Intelligence reports indicated that she had begun to experiment more extensively with her elder blood abilities, using them to travel between dimensions in ways that made her movements more predictable while simultaneously demonstrating the full scope of the powers that the Wild Hunt hoped to acquire. More significantly, these same reports suggested that Ciri's emotional state was becoming increasingly unstable as she struggled with the responsibilities and dangers associated with her unique heritage. The constant pressure of being pursued by forces she did not fully understand, combined with the growing awareness of her own cosmic significance, was creating psychological vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited by opponents who understood the complex relationship between emotional state and elder blood manifestation. Eredin recognized these developments as representing exactly the kind of opportunity that his tactical approach was designed to exploit. A moment when overwhelming force applied at the correct psychological pressure point could achieve results that might be impossible under different circumstances. The key was to identify the specific emotional triggers that would cause Ciri to make mistakes in judgment or tactical positioning, creating windows of vulnerability that could be exploited before her protective network could respond effectively. The strategy that emerged from this analysis focused on targeting the individuals who represented sources of emotional stability and support for Ciri, the theory being that removing or threatening these psychological anchors would create the kind of desperation and poor decision-making that would make capture possible. This approach required detailed intelligence about her personal relationships and emotional attachments, information that could only be acquired through extended surveillance and careful analysis of her behavioral patterns. The surveillance operations that preceded the Wild Hunt's renewed assault on Ciri represented some of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering activities in their long history, combining spectral reconnaissance with temporal manipulation to observe her activities across multiple dimensions and time periods simultaneously. The data collected through these efforts revealed a complex web of relationships and dependencies that could be systematically exploited to create maximum psychological pressure while minimizing the risk of effective resistance. The primary targets identified through this analysis were the individuals who served as parental figures and emotional anchors for Ciri, particularly the Witcher known as Geralt of Rivia and the sorceress called Yennefer of Vengerberg. Intelligence suggested that these two possessed both the combat capabilities necessary to pose genuine threats to Wild Hunt operations and the emotional significance required to make their capture or elimination psychologically devastating for their target. The plan that Eredin developed for exploiting these relationships was characteristically direct and brutal in its efficiency, designed to achieve maximum psychological impact while minimizing the operational risks associated with engaging opponents whose capabilities were not fully understood. Rather than attempting to capture all three simultaneously, which would require dividing their forces and accepting unnecessary tactical complications, the Wild Hunt would focus on acquiring leverage over Ciri through the systematic elimination or capture of her emotional support network. The first phase of this operation targeted Yennefer, whose magical abilities made her both a valuable prize in her own right and a potentially dangerous opponent if left free to interfere with subsequent phases of the plan. The assault on the island sanctuary, where she had taken refuge, was planned with meticulous attention to detail, taking into account both her individual capabilities and the defensive advantages provided by her chosen stronghold. Avalon, the mystical island where Yennefer had established her sanctuary, was protected by ancient magics that made conventional assault difficult if not impossible, but the Wild Hunt's mastery of dimensional manipulation allowed them to bypass many of these defenses through approaches that the original architects had never anticipated. By manifesting simultaneously in multiple dimensional phases, the spectral riders could penetrate barriers that were designed to exclude purely physical threats while maintaining enough substantial presence to engage in actual combat. The battle for Avalon unfolded with the terrible precision that characterized Wild Hunt operations. At their most effective, combining overwhelming force with psychological warfare in ways that systematically broke down both physical defenses and emotional resistance. The sight of spectral warriors materializing from dimensions beyond mortal comprehension, while wielding weapons infused with cosmic frost, created exactly the kind of supernatural terror that made organized resistance impossible for most opponents. Yet, Yennefer proved to be far more formidable than conventional intelligence had suggested. Her mastery of portal magic and temporal manipulation, allowing her to counter many of the Wild Hunt's most sophisticated tactics while inflicting casualties that exceeded all operational projections. The sorceress's desperate defense of her sanctuary demonstrated capabilities that rivaled those of the Iron El themselves, suggesting that the opposition they faced in pursuing Ciri included individuals whose powers approached the levels that the Elder Folk considered their exclusive domain. The eventual success of the assault owed more to the overwhelming numbers and superior equipment that the Wild Hunt could deploy, rather than any fundamental superiority in magical technique or tactical sophistication. Yennefer was ultimately captured not because she was outmatched by individual opponents, but because she was overwhelmed by forces that could sustain losses that would have been catastrophic for any conventional military organization. The capture of Yennefer represented a significant tactical victory for the Wild Hunt, but it also revealed disturbing intelligence about the broader network of opposition that surrounded Ciri. The sorceress's defensive capabilities suggested that her allies possessed knowledge and abilities that went far beyond what would be expected from the mortal inhabitants of conventional worlds, raising questions about whether the Wild Hunt was facing opposition from other interdimensional entities whose capabilities might rival their own. More immediately concerning was the rapid response to Yennefer's capture that demonstrated the existence of communication networks and organizational structures capable of mobilizing effective rescue operations on very short notice. Intelligence reports indicated that Geralt and several other individuals whose capabilities were not fully understood were already moving to intercept the Wild Hunt forces responsible for the sorceress's capture, suggesting that the psychological warfare aspects of Eredin's strategy might be working too effectively for the operational security of his own forces. The confrontation that followed Yennefer's capture took place at a location that the Wild Hunt had chosen specifically for its defensive advantages and symbolic significance, a site known as the Hanged Man's Tree in the war-torn territories of Nilfgaard. This ancient gallows had been used for centuries to execute criminals and political prisoners, making it an appropriately ominous setting for negotiations that would determine the fate of individuals whose actions would shape the destiny of multiple worlds. Eredin's plan for this confrontation was designed to demonstrate the Wild Hunt's overwhelming superiority, while creating conditions that would force Geralt and his companions to make choices that served elven interests regardless of their personal preferences. By displaying Yennefer in obvious distress but not immediate mortal danger, he could create psychological pressure that would compel her would-be rescuers to accept terms that they would normally reject, trading their own freedom for her safety in ways that would ultimately deliver Ciri into Wild Hunt custody. The arrival of the rescue force at the designated location confirmed many of the intelligence assessments that had guided the operation's planning, while also revealing new information about the capabilities and motivations of the individuals who formed Ciri's protective network. Geralt appeared as expected, accompanied by several other witches whose combat abilities were clearly formidable but whose magical capabilities remained within the parameters that Eredin's forces were prepared to counter. More intriguing was the presence of individuals whose origins and affiliations remained mysterious, but whose equipment and tactical knowledge suggested connections to organizations or powers that the Wild Hunt had not previously encountered. These unknown factors introduced elements of uncertainty into what should have been a carefully controlled negotiation, creating possibilities for outcomes that had not been anticipated in the original operational planning. The negotiation itself unfolded according to patterns that Eredin had employed successfully in countless previous operations, combining displays of overwhelming force with offers of limited mercy to create conditions where resistance seemed both futile and unnecessarily costly. The psychological dynamics involved in such encounters were well understood by the Wild Hunt leadership, who had spent centuries perfecting techniques for breaking down the will to resist, while providing face-saving alternatives that made surrender seem like rational choice rather than cowardly capitulation. Yet Geralt proved to be a more sophisticated opponent than typical rescue attempts involved. His responses to Wild Hunt's psychological warfare, suggesting both extensive experience with supernatural threats and access to knowledge about elven capabilities that should have been impossible for mortal inhabitants of conventional worlds to acquire. His tactical decisions reflected understanding of Wild Hunt operational methods that implied either extensive study or previous direct encounters that intelligence reports had failed to identify. The ultimate resolution of this confrontation came not through the systematic breakdown of resistance that Eredin had planned, but through an unexpected offer from Geralt himself, a proposal that transformed the entire nature of the negotiation while creating possibilities that neither side had previously considered. Rather than accepting the terms that the Wild Hunt offered for Yennefer's release, the Witcher proposed an alternative arrangement that would serve elven interests while avoiding the casualties and complications that a direct assault would inevitably produce. Geralt's offer to surrender himself in exchange for Yennefer's freedom represented exactly the kind of dramatic gesture that the Wild Hunt's psychological warfare was designed to provoke, but it also created opportunities that exceeded the value of simply acquiring another prisoner. Intelligence about the Witcher suggested that his capabilities and knowledge might make him valuable not merely as a hostage but as an active participant in Wild Hunt operations, his skills and experience potentially enhancing their effectiveness in ways that conventional recruitment could never achieve. More significantly, Geralt's emotional significance to Ciri meant that his cooperation with the Wild Hunt would create psychological pressures that might prove more effective than any amount of direct coercion in securing her eventual compliance with elven objectives. The sight of her beloved mentor serving the forces that pursued her would be devastating to her emotional stability, while simultaneously demonstrating the futility of continued resistance against opponents who could turn even her strongest allies into instruments of her capture. The decision to accept Geralt's offer represented a significant departure from the Wild Hunt's standard operational procedures, which typically avoided taking prisoners whose capabilities might pose ongoing security risks or whose presence might complicate the command structures that governed Spectral Rider operations. Yet the potential benefits of incorporating such a valuable asset into their organization seemed to outweigh the risks involved, particularly given the desperate circumstances that made conventional approaches to acquiring Ciri's cooperation seem increasingly unlikely to succeed. The integration of Geralt into Wild Hunt operations required significant adjustments in both tactical methods and organizational structures, modifications that reflected the unique challenges of incorporating an unwilling but valuable participant whose skills and knowledge could enhance their effectiveness, while whose motivations and loyalties remained fundamentally opposed to their objectives. The magical bindings and psychological conditioning techniques employed to ensure his compliance represented some of the most sophisticated coercive methods in the Ainel arsenal, combining physical restraints with mental influences designed to suppress resistance while preserving the capabilities that made him valuable. The years that followed Geralt's capture saw the Wild Hunt's operational effectiveness reach levels that exceeded even Eredin's most optimistic projections, as the Witcher's knowledge of mortal psychology and tactical methods provided insights that enhanced their ability to conduct successful raids while minimizing casualties and operational complications. His understanding of the various defensive measures and organizational structures that mortal populations typically employed against supernatural threats allowed the Spectral Riders to anticipate and counter resistance more effectively than had ever been possible through conventional intelligence gathering. Yet the most significant benefit of Geralt's forced participation in Wild Hunt operations was not tactical, but strategic, as his presence created exactly the kind of psychological pressure on Ciri that Eredin had hoped to achieve through his systematic targeting of her emotional support network. Intelligence reports suggested that news of her mentor's capture and collaboration with her pursuers was having devastating effects on her emotional stability and decision-making capabilities, creating vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited to achieve the capture that remained their ultimate objective. The psychological warfare campaign that utilized Geralt's unwilling participation as its primary weapon proved to be more effective than any previous approach the Wild Hunt had employed, succeeding in isolating Ciri from potential allies while creating conditions of desperation that made her increasingly prone to the kind of tactical errors that could be exploited by opponents who understood her emotional weaknesses. The sight of her beloved mentor serving the forces that pursued her created exactly the kind of despair and confusion that made rational resistance impossible, while opening pathways for manipulation that more conventional approaches could never have achieved. The ultimate success of this strategy came in 1270, when Ciri finally attempted a rescue operation designed to free Geralt from Wild Hunt custody, an effort that represented exactly the kind of predictable emotional response that Eredin's psychological warfare was designed to provoke. Her desperate assault on Wild Hunt positions created opportunities for counter-operations that should have resulted in her immediate capture, bringing to fruition years of careful planning and resource investment. Yet even this carefully orchestrated trap ultimately failed to achieve its intended objectives, as Ciri's abilities and determination exceeded even the most sophisticated projections that Wild Hunt intelligence had developed about her capabilities. The rescue operation that should have delivered her into Elven custody instead resulted in Geralt's liberation and the temporary dispersion of Wild Hunt forces, leaving Eredin with nothing to show for years of effort except increased knowledge about the formidable opposition he continued to face. The failure of this elaborate operation marked the end of one phase of the Wild Hunt's pursuit of Ciri, while simultaneously revealing the fundamental limitations of approaches that relied primarily on conventional tactics and psychological manipulation. The girl whose elder blood abilities represented the key to transcending the White Frost's threat had proven herself capable of overcoming even the most sophisticated strategies that the Wild Hunt could deploy against her, suggesting that achieving their objectives would require methods that went beyond anything they had previously attempted. The stage was now set for the final phase of their pursuit, a phase that would test not only their tactical capabilities, but their understanding of the cosmic forces that governed Elder Blood magic and the fundamental nature of power itself. The hunt that had begun as a relatively straightforward capture operation had evolved into something approaching a war between different concepts of destiny, a conflict whose ultimate resolution would determine not only the fate of individuals, but the fundamental structure of the multiverse itself. The year 1272 dawned with omens that even the most skeptical scholars could not dismiss as mere coincidence or natural phenomenon, for the very fabric of reality seemed to tremble with anticipation of events that would reshape the fundamental structure of existence itself. Across multiple worlds and dimensions, seers and prophets reported visions of unprecedented clarity and urgency, while the magical energies that flowed through the cosmic void between realms pulsed with rhythms that suggested the approach of some cosmic culmination that had been building for centuries. In the crystalline halls of Tirnalia, where the advancing white frost had begun to touch even the outermost districts with fingers of supernatural cold, Eredin Break Glass stood before maps and charts that documented the current state of his interdimensional empire with the grim satisfaction of a general who finally understood the true nature of the war he was fighting. The failure of his elaborate psychological warfare campaign against Ciri had taught him valuable lessons about the limitations of conventional tactics when applied to opponents who possessed genuine cosmic significance, lessons that would guide his approach to what he now recognized must be the final phase of their centuries-long hunt. The intelligence reports that covered his planning table told a story of escalating desperation that reflected not only the Wild Hunt's growing urgency, but also the increasingly unstable situation of their primary target. Ciri's movements between dimensions had become more frequent and less controlled, suggesting that the psychological pressure of constant pursuit was beginning to affect her judgment and her mastery of the elder blood abilities that made her so valuable to elven interests. More significantly, her periods of vulnerability were lasting longer and occurring in locations that offered better opportunities for successful capture operations. The network of allies and protectors that had previously made direct assault on Ciri seem impossible was showing signs of strain and fragmentation as the prolonged conflict took its toll on individuals who possessed great power but remained fundamentally mortal in their limitations and vulnerabilities. Intelligence suggested that disagreements about strategy and tactics were creating divisions within her support structure that could potentially be exploited by opponents who understood how to manipulate such internal conflicts to their potats' advantage. Most importantly of all, Ciri herself appeared to be growing weary of the constant flight and concealment that had defined her existence since the Wild Hunt first identified her as their primary target. Reports from various sources suggested that she was beginning to consider more aggressive responses to her pursuit, possibly including direct confrontation with her elven tormentors, rather than the evasive tactics that had characterized her approach to the conflict thus far. This shift in her psychological state represented exactly the kind of opportunity that Eredin had been waiting for, a moment when desperation and exhaustion might drive her to make the kind of tactical errors that would create openings for the overwhelming force that remained the Wild Hunt's most reliable weapon. The key was to create conditions that would encourage her to commit to a direct confrontation, while ensuring that such an encounter took place under circumstances that maximized elven advantages while minimizing the unpredictable factors that had disrupted previous operations. The strategy that emerged from this analysis represented a fundamental departure from the Wild Hunt's traditional operational methods, abandoning the hit-and-run tactics that had served them well in favor of a massive, concentrated assault designed to overwhelm all resistance through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Rather than attempting to isolate Ciri from her protectors, Eredin would invite direct confrontation with her entire support network, confident that the Wild Hunt's superior capabilities would prove decisive when applied without reservation or restraint. The location chosen for this climactic confrontation was itself a statement of intent that demonstrated Eredin's complete commitment to achieving victory, regardless of the costs involved. Kaer Morhen, the ancient fortress that served as both sanctuary and training ground for the Witcher organization, represented everything that stood between the Wild Hunt and their ultimate objectives. By attacking this stronghold directly, Eredin would force his enemies to defend a fixed position while allowing him to deploy the full range of capabilities that the Wild Hunt had developed over centuries of interdimensional warfare. The symbolic significance of assaulting the Witcher's primary stronghold was not lost on anyone involved in the operation's planning, for these monster hunters had become synonymous with resistance to supernatural threats, and their defeat would send a message that resonated far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The destruction of Kaer Morhen would demonstrate that no sanctuary was secure against the Wild Hunt's power, while the capture of Ciri within its walls would prove that even the most determined resistance was ultimately futile when confronted with truly superior force. The assault force that Eredin assembled for this operation represented the largest concentration of Wild Hunt power that had ever been deployed in a single engagement, drawing upon resources and personnel from across their entire interdimensional empire to create a military force capable of overwhelming any conceivable resistance. Spectral riders from dozens of different raiding units were recalled from operations across multiple worlds, while the most advanced weapons and equipment in the Elven arsenal were allocated to ensure that no defensive measure could withstand their assault. The integration of White Frost weaponry into this massive force multiplied its destructive potential beyond anything that mortal defenders could hope to counter, for the cosmic phenomenon's ability to drain life force from its targets made conventional defensive strategies ineffective, while its psychological impact would demoralize enemies even before actual combat began. The sight of spectral warriors wielding the power of universal entropy would create terror that transcended rational fear, touching primal anxieties about death and dissolution that no amount of training or courage could completely overcome. The enhanced creatures that accompanied the Wild Hunt's assault added another dimension of supernatural horror to what was already shaping up to be a conflict that would challenge every assumption about the nature of warfare itself. The spectral hounds that had been infused with White Frost essence possessed capabilities that made them more than mere attack animals, transforming them into harbingers of cosmic dissolution whose very presence could begin the crystallization process that characterized the phenomenon's natural advance. These enhanced creatures moved through dimensions with the same ethereal grace that characterized their elven masters, appearing and disappearing at will, while maintaining enough physical presence to inflict devastating wounds on any opponent who underestimated their reality. Their howls carried frequencies that resonated across multiple planes of existence simultaneously, creating sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere while inspiring despair that went beyond anything that natural predators could achieve. The aerial support provided by the Nagalfar, the Wild Hunt's legendary ship that could sail through sky and void with equal ease, transformed the assault from a conventional siege into something approaching a cosmic catastrophe. The vessel's ability to manifest in multiple dimensional phases simultaneously allowed it to rain destruction from angles that defenders could not anticipate or counter, while its mere presence in the skies above Kaer Morhen created an atmosphere of supernatural dread that affected the morale and effectiveness of everyone within its shadow. The ship itself had been enhanced with White Frost weaponry that could project the cosmic phenomenon's effects across vast distances, allowing it to begin the crystallization of defensive positions before ground forces even made contact with their targets. The sight of ancient stone walls beginning to transform into ice that drained rather than merely froze created exactly the kind of existential horror that made rational defensive planning impossible, while demonstrating the futility of resisting forces that commanded cosmic powers. The timing of the assault was calculated to coincide with seasonal and dimensional factors that would maximize the Wild Hunt's advantages while minimizing the effectiveness of potential resistance. The winter months that had always been their preferred period for major operations were enhanced by cosmic alignments that made dimensional manipulation easier, while simultaneously reducing the defensive capabilities of opponents who relied on conventional magic or natural phenomena for their power. The psychological warfare that preceded the actual assault was designed to create maximum terror and confusion among the defenders, while providing additional opportunities for intelligence gathering about their capabilities and defensive preparations. Spectral manifestations appeared throughout the region surrounding Kaer Morhen for weeks before the main assault, creating an atmosphere of siege mentality that wore down resistance while providing detailed reconnaissance information about defensive positions and tactical planning. These preliminary operations revealed that the Witchers and their allies were indeed preparing for a major confrontation, their defensive measures suggesting both detailed knowledge of Wild Hunt capabilities and access to resources and expertise that exceeded what should have been available to residents of a single world. The magical fortifications that were being constructed around Kaer Morhen incorporated techniques and materials that suggested influence from interdimensional sources, raising questions about whether the Wild Hunt was facing opposition from other cosmic powers whose involvement had not been previously detected. More concerning were intelligence reports suggesting that Ciri's allies had developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize some of the Wild Hunt's most sophisticated weapons and tactics. The defensive preparations visible around Kaer Morhen included barriers and deflection fields that seemed designed to counter spectral manifestations, while the personnel being assembled for the fortress's defense included individuals whose capabilities remained mysterious, but whose presence suggested access to knowledge and resources that conventional intelligence gathering had failed to identify. Yet despite these troubling signs of more formidable opposition than previously anticipated, Eredin remained confident that the massive force he had assembled would prove adequate to overcome any resistance that mortal defenders could organize. The scale of the Wild Hunt assault exceeded anything that had been attempted in their long history, while the integration of White Frost weaponry provided capabilities that transcended normal tactical limitations by attacking the fundamental processes that made life and resistance possible. The actual commencement of the assault on Kaer Morhen began not with conventional military attacks, but with a display of cosmic power designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance while providing opportunities for Ciri to surrender voluntarily, rather than watching her sanctuary and protectors be systematically destroyed. The Naglfar positioned itself directly above the fortress, while projecting white frost effects that began the slow crystallization of the surrounding landscape, creating a zone of supernatural cold that advanced steadily toward the defensive positions, while giving defenders time to contemplate their inevitable fate. This calculated demonstration of overwhelming force was accompanied by spectral manifestations that surrounded the fortress with images of the Wild Hunt in all its terrible glory, their numbers appearing far greater than they actually were, through dimensional manipulation techniques that created echoes and reflections across multiple planes of existence. The sight of countless skeletal warriors mounted on shadow-dark steeds that seemed to fill the sky itself would have been sufficient to break the morale of most opponents, creating opportunities for negotiated surrender that would avoid the casualties and destruction that total warfare would inevitably produce. Yet the defenders of Kaer Morhen proved to be far more resilient than conventional psychological warfare could overcome. Their response to the Wild Hunt's intimidation, displaying both courage and tactical sophistication that suggested extensive preparation for exactly this type of confrontation. Rather than surrendering or attempting futile resistance, they activated defensive measures that demonstrated capabilities rivaling those of the Elder Folk themselves, while launching counterattacks that inflicted actual casualties on forces that had grown accustomed to operating with impunity. The battle that followed challenged every assumption about the nature of interdimensional warfare that had guided Wild Hunt operations for centuries, as conventional advantages in mobility and firepower were neutralized by opponents who seemed to possess both detailed knowledge of elven tactics and access to weapons and techniques that could match the most sophisticated capabilities in Teal, the Ainel arsenal. The spectral riders who had terrorized countless worlds found themselves engaged in desperate combat against enemies who refused to be intimidated, while possessing the power to inflict genuine harm on beings who existed primarily in Parma, ethereal form. The most shocking aspect of this resistance was not the courage or skill that the defenders displayed, but the effectiveness of their countermeasures against what should have been insurmountable advantages. The White Frost weaponry that had proven devastatingly effective against every previous target was countered by defensive techniques that seemed to draw power from the phenomenon itself, turning the cosmic plague's effects back against its wielders, while protecting potential victims from the crystallization process that normally made resistance impossible. Even more disturbing was the gradual realization that the opposition they faced included individuals whose mastery of dimensional manipulation rivaled that of the elder folk themselves, beings who could counter spectral manifestations while maintaining enough physical presence to engage in direct combat with creatures whose existence transcended normal categories of life and death. The tactical advantages that had made the Wild Hunt seemingly invincible were systematically neutralized by opponents who seemed to understand their capabilities better than they understood themselves. The turning point of the battle came not through superior tactics or overwhelming force, but through the emergence of factors that neither side had fully anticipated or planned for during their respective preparations. The prolonged combat between forces wielding cosmic powers began to affect the fundamental structure of reality in the region surrounding Kaer Morhen, creating dimensional instabilities that threatened to engulf both attackers and defenders in spatial distortions that could destroy entire worlds. More significantly, the intense magical energies being deployed by both sides began to resonate with Elder Blood phenomena in ways that amplified Ciri's abilities far beyond their normal parameters, transforming her from a powerful individual into something approaching a force of nature whose mere presence began to affect the outcome of battles being fought across multiple dimensional planes simultaneously. The girl whose capture had been the ultimate objective of the assault was rapidly becoming powerful enough to determine its outcome through direct intervention rather than remaining the passive prize that both sides sought to claim. The manifestation of Ciri's enhanced abilities reached its climax in response to a tragedy that neither the Wild Hunt's psychological warfare nor the defenders' strategic planning had anticipated. Vesemir, the elderly witcher who served as both mentor and father figure to the warriors defending Kaer Morhen, fell victim to one of Eredin's personal attacks, his death creating exactly the kind of emotional trauma that Elder Blood magic seemed to require for its most dramatic manifestations. The explosion of power that followed Vesemir's sacrifice was unlike anything that had been recorded in the long history of Elder Blood phenomena, a release of cosmic energy that transcended normal magical categories while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections that Ainel scholars had developed about the potential applications of such abilities. The shockwave that emanated from Ciri's position destroyed Wild Hunt forces across multiple dimensions simultaneously, their spectral forms proving no more resistant to Elder Blood effects than conventional physical existence would have been. The devastation inflicted on the assault force by this unprecedented display of power was so complete that it transformed what should have been a decisive victory into a catastrophic defeat that threatened the very existence of the Wild Hunt as an effective military organization. Centuries of careful recruitment and training were wiped out in moments, while the survivors of the cosmic explosion found themselves scattered across dimensions, with no clear means of regrouping or continuing their mission. Yet even this devastating setback did not mark the end of Wild Hunt operations against Ciri and her protectors, for Eredin himself survived the explosion through his mastery of dimensional manipulation while retaining enough forces to continue pursuing objectives that had become even more critical to Ainel's survival in light of what they had witnessed. The power that Ciri had displayed represented exactly the kind of cosmic capability that could transcend the White Frost's threat, making her acquisition more essential than ever, despite the enormous costs that previous attempts had already extracted. The tactical withdrawal from Kaer Morhen represented not surrender but strategic repositioning, as the Wild Hunt adapted its approach to account for the new realities revealed by their encounter with fully awakened Elder Blood abilities. The conventional assault tactics that had served them well against lesser opponents would need to be replaced by methods that could counter or circumvent powers that operated according to cosmic principles rather than normal magical laws. The intelligence gathered during the failed assault provided valuable insights into both the capabilities and limitations of elder blood phenomena that would guide future operations against targets whose power exceeded anything the Wild Hunt had previously encountered. While Ciri's abilities were clearly formidable when fully aroused, they appeared to require specific emotional triggers and extraordinary circumstances to achieve their maximum effect, suggesting that future operations could be designed to avoid provoking such dramatic manifestations while creating opportunities for more subtle forms of manipulation and control. Most significantly, the battle at Kaer Morhen had demonstrated that direct confrontation with fully prepared opponents was no longer a viable strategy for achieving Wild Hunt objectives, requiring instead a return to the patience and subtlety that had characterized their most successful operations during the early centuries of their interdimensional expansion. The hunt for Ciri would continue, but it would need to evolve into something more sophisticated than the overwhelming force that had previously served their purposes so effectively. The stage was now set for a final phase of operations that would test not only the Wild Hunt's tactical capabilities, but their fundamental understanding of power and cosmic significance, a phase that would determine whether centuries of patient expansion and careful planning could ultimately achieve objectives that seemed to require capabilities beyond anything that conventional military force could provide. The catastrophic defeat at Kaer Morhen had shattered more than merely the Wild Hunt's tactical capabilities and operational confidence, for it had exposed fundamental weaknesses in their understanding of the cosmic forces they sought to control, while revealing the existence of opposition whose capabilities rivaled their own most sophisticated achievements. The spectral riders who had returned from that nightmare battlefield carried with them not only the physical wounds that elder blood magic could inflict even on beings who existed primarily in ethereal form, but also the psychological trauma of discovering that their centuries of apparent invincibility had been built upon assumptions that proved catastrophically false when tested against truly formidable opponents. Eredin Break Glass stood in the ruins of what had once been a command center designed to coordinate interdimensional operations across multiple worlds, its crystalline surfaces now cracked and darkened by the backwash of energies that had accompanied his forces' desperate retreat from their encounter with powers that transcended normal magical categories. The reports scattered across his planning table told a story of losses so severe that they challenged the very viability of continued operations, while the intelligence gathered during the failed assault painted a picture of opposition that possessed both the knowledge and the capability to counter the Wild Hunt's most sophisticated weapons and tactics. Yet even in the depths of what appeared to be total defeat, even as the White Frost continued its inexorable advance across the Ainel homeland, while their primary means of transcending its threat seemed to slip ever further beyond their reach, new possibilities were beginning to emerge from sources that had been overlooked during the desperate urgency of recent operations. The network of relationships and conflicting interests that surrounded Ciri was proving to be more complex and potentially exploitable than previous intelligence assessments had suggested, creating opportunities for subtler approaches that might succeed, where overwhelming force had failed so completely. The key to these emerging possibilities lay in the person of Avalak, whose departure from active participation in Wild Hunt operations had initially been viewed as a significant loss, but whose independent research into elder blood phenomena had apparently yielded insights that could transform their entire approach to acquiring the cosmic capabilities they so desperately needed. Intelligence reports suggested that the elven sage had not only maintained contact with Ciri during his absence, but had actually succeeded in gaining her trust through methods that emphasized cooperation and mutual benefit rather than coercion and capture. This revelation challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of elder blood magic that had guided Wild Hunt's strategy since their first encounter with Ciri's abilities, assumptions that had led them to pursue acquisition through force rather than persuasion, while ignoring the possibility that such powers might respond more favorably to approaches that respected rather than violated their inherent nature. The failure of conventional tactics at Kaer Morhen suggested that these overlooked alternatives might represent not merely different methods, but fundamentally superior strategies for achieving objectives that transcended normal limitations of power and control. The decision to investigate these possibilities required swallowing pride that had been centuries in the building, acknowledging that the martial traditions which had served the Wild Hunt so effectively in conquering lesser opponents might be inadequate for dealing with cosmic forces that operated according to principles beyond conventional understanding. Yet the advancing white frost and the increasingly desperate situation of their entire civilization left little room for the luxury of maintaining tactical preferences that had proven ineffective against their most critical targets. The search for Avalach and the intelligence he had gathered during his independent operations led Eredin and his surviving forces across dimensions that had been distorted by the magical energies unleashed during the battle at Kaer Morhen, regions of space and time where reality itself seemed uncertain, and the normal rules governing interdimensional travel had been temporarily suspended. These cosmic scars bore witness to the incredible power that elder blood magic could deploy when fully aroused, while simultaneously demonstrating why conventional approaches to controlling such phenomena were doomed to failure from their very conception. The eventual location of Avalach revealed that his apparent defection from Wild Hunt operations had been motivated not by disagreement with their ultimate objectives, but by recognition that achieving those objectives would require methods so fundamentally different from their traditional approaches that they could not be implemented within existing organizational structures. His work with Ciri had been designed not to betray elven interests, but to advance them through strategies that took into account the true nature of elder blood magic, rather than attempting to force such phenomena into frameworks designed for conventional forms of power. The intelligence that Avalach had gathered during his time working with Ciri painted a picture of elder blood capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections that elven scholars had developed. But it also revealed limitations and requirements that suggested methods for achieving beneficial cooperation rather than simple exploitation. These cosmic abilities were not merely powerful magical techniques that could be stolen or transferred, but integral aspects of cosmic patterns that connected individual wielders to fundamental forces governing the structure of reality itself. Most significantly, Avalach's research had revealed that elder blood magic possessed defensive characteristics that made it virtually immune to coercive acquisition, responding to attempts at forced control by amplifying its resistance while diminishing its beneficial effects until coercion became counterproductive regardless of the methods employed. This explained the catastrophic failure of the assault on Kaer Morhen, while suggesting that alternative approaches based on cooperation and mutual benefit might achieve results that pure force could never accomplish. The strategic framework that emerged from this intelligence required abandoning not merely specific tactics, but the entire philosophical approach that had guided Wild Hunt operations since their transformation from conventional cavalry into interdimensional raiders. Instead of viewing Ciri as a resource to be acquired and exploited, they would need to approach her as a potential partner whose cooperation could be earned through methods that served her interests as well as their own, creating relationships based on mutual benefit rather than domination and submission. This fundamental shift in approach required identifying incentives that could motivate Ciri to cooperate voluntarily with objectives that would ultimately serve elven interests, while providing her with benefits that justified the risks and commitments involved in such cooperation. The intelligence gathered by Avalanche suggested several possibilities for creating such mutually beneficial arrangements, ranging from assistance with mastering her abilities to protection from other cosmic threats that might seek to exploit her powers for purposes even more destructive than anything the Wild Hunt had contemplated. Most promising of all was the possibility that Ciri's elder blood abilities could be developed and directed in ways that would benefit both her personal objectives and the broader cosmic patterns that her powers were apparently designed to serve, creating outcomes that transcended the zero-sum competition that had characterized previous approaches to this problem. Rather than attempting to steal or transfer her abilities, the Wild Hunt could potentially gain access to their benefits through partnership arrangements that preserved her autonomy while ensuring elven survival and prosperity. The implementation of this radically different strategic approach required not only swallowing personal pride, but also overcoming internal resistance from Wild Hunt personnel who had spent centuries developing expertise in methods that emphasized dominance and coercion over cooperation and persuasion. The cultural transformation required to make such partnerships possible would challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of power and the proper relationship between superior and inferior beings that had guided Ain-El civilization since their flight from their original homeworld. Yet, the alternative to attempting such cultural evolution was the continued pursuit of strategies that had already proven catastrophically ineffective, while the White Frost consumed ever larger portions of their homeland and their window for achieving any solution continued to narrow with each passing season. The choice was not between preferred and less preferred methods, but between attempting unprecedented cooperation and facing certain extinction as their civilization was gradually consumed by cosmic forces beyond their power to control or escape. The first step toward implementing this new approach involved establishing contact with elements within Ciri's support network that might be amenable to negotiated settlements rather than continued warfare. Individuals whose motivations and objectives might align sufficiently with elven interests to create foundations for more comprehensive agreements. The intelligence gathered during previous operations had identified several potential candidates for such approaches, though each presented unique challenges and opportunities that would need to be carefully evaluated and exploited. The most promising of these opportunities lay within the political structures of the Ain-El homeland itself, where the revelation of King Oberon's true cause of death could potentially be used to reshape the entire power structure that governed their civilization, while creating new possibilities for approaches that had been impossible under previous leadership arrangements. The investigation of this possibility required delicate maneuvering through factional politics that had been building for decades, but it also offered the potential for transforming their entire strategic situation through a single, well-executed revelation. The key to this political opportunity lay in Geralt, an elven noble whose position within the court hierarchy had made him privy to information about royal succession that could be used to expose the circumstances surrounding Oberon's death, while positioning alternative leadership that might be more amenable to cooperative approaches with external powers. His motivations were complex and not entirely aligned with Wild Hunt interests, but his capabilities and access to critical information made him an essential element in any strategy designed to transform the fundamental nature of elven policy toward elder blood phenomena. The negotiation with Gales required acknowledging truths about Eredin's rise to power that had been carefully concealed for decades, admissions that could potentially undermine the legitimacy of his entire reign, while creating opportunities for opponents to challenge his authority through methods that went beyond conventional political maneuvering. Yet the desperate circumstances facing their civilization made such risks acceptable if they created genuine possibilities for achieving objectives that more conventional approaches had proven incapable of accomplishing. The revelation that Eredin had deliberately caused King Oberon's death through calculated overdose rather than accidental miscalculation transformed the entire political landscape within Ainel society, creating opportunities for power realignments that had seemed impossible under previous circumstances, while simultaneously undermining the authority structures that had enabled wild hunt operations to continue despite their increasing ineffectiveness. The consequences of this exposure extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations, reshaping the fundamental nature of elven civilization in ways that would affect their development for centuries to come. Gel's response to these revelations demonstrated both the sophisticated political intelligence that had made him a valuable potential ally and the complex motivations that made him potentially dangerous as either partner or opponent. His agreement to withdraw support from Eredin's continued pursuit of Ciri reflected not conversion to alternative philosophical approaches, but recognition that current strategies were unsustainable, while new approaches might offer better prospects for achieving objectives that served broader elven interests rather than merely personal ambitions. This political transformation within Ainel society created new possibilities for approaches to the Ciri problem that went beyond military solutions, but it also created new urgencies, as the withdrawal of internal support made continued large-scale operations impossible, while the White Frost's advance allowed no time for extended negotiations or gradual relationship building. The window for achieving any solution to their existential crisis was narrowing rapidly, making it essential to pursue all remaining possibilities simultaneously rather than sequentially. The naval engagement that represented one of the final major military operations of the conflict demonstrated both the evolution of wild hunt capabilities and the persistent limitations that conventional tactics faced when deployed against opponents who possessed comparable technological and magical resources. The Nilfgaardian fleet that had been assembled to support Ciri's operations represented a level of military organization and equipment that challenged previous assumptions about the technological capabilities of mortal civilizations, while their tactical coordination suggested access to intelligence and planning resources that exceeded what should have been available to inhabitants of single worlds. Caranthir's use of White Frost weaponry to freeze the enemy fleet in place represented one of the most successful applications of cosmic phenomenon manipulation that the Wild Hunt had achieved, demonstrating capabilities that transcended normal limitations of naval warfare while creating tactical opportunities that conventional weapons could never have provided. The sight of an entire fleet transformed into ice sculptures that retained their original forms while being drained of everything that made them operationally viable created exactly the kind of supernatural terror that had made the Wild Hunt legendary across multiple worlds. Yet even this demonstration of seemingly overwhelming supernatural power proved insufficient to achieve decisive victory against opponents who possessed both the courage to continue fighting despite witnessing cosmic horror and the capabilities to counter even the most sophisticated applications of weaponized natural phenomena. Ciri's intervention in the naval battle demonstrated that her Elder Blood abilities had continued to evolve and strengthen, reaching levels that allowed her to counter White Frost effects directly, while maintaining enough additional capability to engage in tactical combat against multiple sophisticated opponents simultaneously. The destruction of Caranthir and his accompanying forces marked another catastrophic loss for the Wild Hunt's operational capabilities, eliminating one of their most skilled navigators while demonstrating that even their most advanced weapons and tactics remained vulnerable to elder blood magic when wielded by opponents who understood their true cosmic significance. The pattern of defeats was becoming undeniable, suggesting that conventional military solutions to the Ciri problem were not merely difficult but fundamentally impossible given the nature of the powers involved. The realization that their most sophisticated weapons and tactics were inadequate for achieving their primary objectives created pressures for even more radical departures from traditional approaches, pushing the conflict toward resolutions that would depend more on personal confrontation between individual wielders of cosmic power than on large-scale military operations. The stage was being set for final encounters that would test not only tactical capabilities but fundamental understanding of the nature of power and cosmic significance itself. Eredin's recognition that the conflict was approaching its final phase led to decisions that prioritized immediate tactical advantage over long-term strategic considerations, accepting risks and costs that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances while pursuing objectives that represented their last realistic hope for achieving any form of beneficial outcome. The personal confrontation that he now sought with both Ciri and her primary protectors reflected not confidence in victory, but acceptance that alternatives to direct confrontation had been exhausted through the failure of every other approach they had attempted. The challenge issued to Geralt represented both acknowledgement of the Witcher's significance as a tactical factor and recognition that some forms of opposition could only be eliminated through personal combat rather than institutional pressure or organizational manipulation. The skills and knowledge that had made Geralt such a valuable asset during his forced service with the Wild Hunt also made him uniquely dangerous as an opponent, requiring elimination through methods that matched individual capability rather than attempting to overwhelm superior personal prowess through numerical advantage or technological superiority. The dimensional battlefield chosen for this confrontation reflected the cosmic scope of the conflict that had evolved from simple resource acquisition into something approaching a war between different concepts of power and cosmic significance. The ability to fight across multiple planes of existence simultaneously tested not only combat skills but fundamental understanding of the nature of reality itself, requiring participants to maintain coherent tactical awareness, while their consciousness operated in dimensions that exceeded normal sensory capabilities. The battle itself unfolded with the terrible intensity that characterized confrontations between beings whose capabilities transcended normal limitations, while whose motivations admitted no possibility of compromise or negotiation. Each exchange tested not only immediate tactical skills, but the accumulated wisdom and experience that both participants had developed across lifetimes, devoted to perfecting their respective approaches to conflict and survival, creating a contest that served as culmination of centuries of development and preparation. The final moments of this cosmic duel played out aboard the Naglfar itself, the legendary ship that had served as symbol of Wild Hunt power across multiple worlds, now becoming the site where that power would either achieve its ultimate triumph or meet its final defeat. The familiar environment that should have provided tactical advantage to its master instead became merely another stage for determining whether conventional approaches to cosmic power could ultimately prevail against forces that operated according to principles beyond normal understanding. When Eredin Break Glass finally fell to Geralt's blade, when the king of the Wild Hunt breathed his last aboard the vessel that had carried terror across countless worlds, more died than simply another elven warrior whose ambitions had exceeded his capabilities. The entire philosophical framework that had guided Ainel's civilization for centuries died with him, along with the belief that superior technology and tactical sophistication could overcome any opposition, regardless of the cosmic significance of the forces involved. The dissolution of Wild Hunt power that followed Eredin's death was not merely organizational but ontological, reflecting the degree to which their interdimensional empire had been built around concepts of dominance and exploitation that proved unsustainable when confronted with powers that operated according to different principles entirely. The spectral riders who had terrorized multiple worlds found themselves suddenly mortal and vulnerable, their ethereal advantages dissolving as the magical frameworks that had sustained them collapsed along with the authority structures that had created and maintained them. The liberation of enslaved populations across multiple worlds proceeded with the same inevitable momentum that had once characterized Wild Hunt expansion, as beings who had been held in bondage through combinations of technological superiority and supernatural terror discovered that their captors were no longer invulnerable to resistance or retaliation. The interdimensional empire that had seemed destined to expand indefinitely suddenly contracted toward its home base as former subjects either fled to freedom or turned against masters whose power had proven to be far less absolute than anyone had believed. Yet even in defeat, even as their civilization crumbled around them, and their homeland continued to be consumed by the white frost, whose threat they had never successfully addressed, the legacy of the Wild Hunt's centuries of expansion would continue to influence the development of countless worlds and the evolution of interdimensional politics in ways that would persist long after their final dissolution as an N12 organized force. The hunt that had begun in desperation and evolved through ambition toward cosmic significance had finally ended, not in triumph or transcendence, but in the recognition that some powers cannot be captured or controlled, only respected and cooperated with according to principles that transcend the conventional understanding of strength and weakness, dominance and submission, victory and defeat. And so the spectral riders who had terrorized countless worlds for over a millennium finally found their rest, not in the triumph they had pursued through dimensions beyond counting, but in the profound silence that follows when ancient hungers consume themselves and leave nothing behind but echoes fading into cosmic void. The skeletal knights who had galloped through winter skies on steeds dark as dying stars, whose very presence could freeze the blood in mortal veins and transform hope into crystalline despair, dissolved like frost beneath the first warm touch of spring sunlight, their reign of terror ending not with apocalyptic battle but with the simple recognition that some forces in the universe are too vast and fundamental to be captured or controlled by any single will, no matter how ancient or determined. The death of Eredin Breakglas aboard the Naglfar marked more than the fall of a king or the collapse of a military organization that had spanned multiple worlds and centuries of conquest. His final breath carried away with it the entire philosophical framework that had sustained the Wild Hunt since their transformation from desperate refugees into cosmic predators, the belief system that had convinced an entire civilization that superiority of technology and ruthlessness of purpose could overcome any obstacle, dominate any opponent, and ultimately transcend the natural limitations that constrained lesser beings to single worlds and finite lifespans. The wraith-like forms that had once struck terror into the hearts of innocents across a dozen different realms found themselves suddenly corporeal and vulnerable, their ethereal advantages dissolving as the magical matrices that had sustained their interdimensional existence collapsed along with the authority structures that had created and maintained them. Warriors who had grown accustomed to existing simultaneously in multiple planes of reality discovered that they were once again bound by the conventional limitations of physical existence, while powers that had seemed as natural as breathing became distant memories of capabilities they could no longer access or control. The interdimensional empire that had taken centuries to construct began to unravel with the same inexorable momentum that had once characterized its expansion, as enslaved populations across multiple worlds realized that their captors were no longer invulnerable to resistance or retaliation. The technological superiority and supernatural terror that had made Wild Hunt dominance seem absolute and eternal proved to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined, dependent upon belief and fear as much as upon genuine capability, crumbling when the fundamental assumptions that supported them were finally challenged by forces that operated according to different principles entirely. Ciri's elder blood flowed free now through dimensions unbound by the artificial constraints that the Ainel had sought to impose upon it. Her abilities finally permitted to develop according to their true cosmic nature, rather than being forced into frameworks designed for conventional forms of magical exploitation. The power that ran through her veins like liquid starlight was not diminished by her refusal to serve elven ambitions, but enhanced by her commitment to using her abilities in harmony with the fundamental patterns that governed the flow of fate and causality across the multiverse. The girl who had been hunted across countless worlds and through the depths of time itself had become something far greater than her pursuers had ever imagined possible. Not through the accumulation of power or the mastery of sophisticated techniques, but through her willingness to serve purposes larger than personal ambition or tribal survival. Her elder blood connected her not merely to ancient magical traditions, but to the cosmic forces that shape the destiny of entire dimensions, making her a guardian of possibilities, rather than simply a wielder of extraordinary abilities. The ruins of Tin Alia stood as monuments to the price of believing that any race, any people, any kingdom possessed the inherent right to feast upon the freedom and dignity of others, their crystalline spires cracked and darkened by the white frost that had finally claimed the Ainel homeland, despite all their desperate efforts to escape or transcend its inexorable advance. The cosmic phenomenon that had driven them from their original world had followed them across dimensional barriers with the patience of geological time, demonstrating that some threats cannot be fled from or fought against, but must be accepted and integrated into larger patterns of existence and transformation. Yet even in the dissolution of their interdimensional empire, even as their civilization crumbled beneath the weight of cosmic forces they had never truly understood, the Ainel's legacy lived on, not in the terror they had sowed, but in the courage of those who had stood against them, proving that even the mightiest predators could fall when faced with love that refused to yield to intimidation or despair. The Wild Hunt's centuries of expansion had ultimately served not their own purposes, but the cosmic plan that connected all things, teaching lessons about power and responsibility that would resonate across dimensions long after their final dissolution as an organized force. The spectral hounds that had once breathed clouds of cosmic frost, capable of transforming living beings into ice sculptures, found themselves reduced to ordinary creatures whose supernatural enhancements faded along with the magical frameworks that had sustained them. The Naglfar, that legendary vessel that had sailed through sky and void with equal ease while carrying terror to countless worlds, settled into the dimensional depths from which it could no longer rise, its hull cracking under pressures that its mystical construction could no longer withstand. The navigators who had maintained the portal networks that made interdimensional raiding possible discovered that their abilities were dependent upon power structures and belief systems that had collapsed along with the civilization they had served, leaving them stranded in whatever dimensions they had been visiting when the final dissolution occurred. Some would eventually find ways to return to worlds where they could live peaceful lives, while others would spend eternity wandering through cosmic voids that no longer recognized their authority or responded to their commands. The enslaved populations who had been captured during centuries of Wild Hunt operations found themselves suddenly free to return to their home worlds and original lives, though many discovered that the temporal distortions associated with interdimensional captivity made such returns psychologically and practically impossible. The children who had been stolen from their families and subjected to systematic cultural conditioning faced the particularly difficult challenge of reconstructing identities and relationships that had been deliberately destroyed by their captors, while the adults who remembered their origins often found that everyone they had once known and loved had aged and died during their absence. Yet freedom, even when complicated by such traumatic circumstances, proved to be a gift beyond price for beings who had been treated as nothing more than renewable resources for exploitation. The opportunity to make choices about their own destinies, to form relationships based on mutual affection rather than ownership, to pursue goals that served their own interests rather than those of their masters, created possibilities for healing and growth that transcended the immediate difficulties associated with liberation from systematic oppression. The worlds that had lived under the shadow of wild hunt raids for generations began the slow process of cultural and psychological recovery, learning to believe once again in the possibility of safety and security, while working to rebuild the social structures and belief systems that centuries of supernatural terror had systematically undermined. Communities that had huddled behind defensive barriers during winter months gradually emerged to reclaim territories that had been abandoned to spectral predators, while children who had grown up knowing only fear of the dark began to discover that shadows could conceal wonders as well as threats. The seasonal patterns that had governed wild hunt operations for centuries gradually faded from cultural memory as new generations grew up without the expectation that winter would bring ethereal riders seeking to harvest their lives and freedom. The rituals and superstitions that had developed around protection from spectral attacks evolved into festivals and celebrations that commemorated survival and resilience rather than serving purely defensive purposes, transforming fear into hope while preserving important lessons about the value of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The scholar warriors who had once devoted their lives to studying wild hunt phenomena and developing countermeasures against spectral warfare found new purposes in documenting and preserving the knowledge they had accumulated, ensuring that future generations would understand both the nature of the threats that had been overcome and the methods that had proven effective against seemingly invincible enemies. Their libraries became repositories of wisdom about the nature of cosmic power and the importance of resisting those who would use such power for purposes of domination and exploitation. Some among these scholars dedicated themselves to understanding the broader implications of the wild hunt's rise and fall, seeking to identify the cosmic patterns that had made such an organization possible, while developing philosophical frameworks that might prevent similar threats from emerging in future ages. Their work revealed that the vulnerability of mortal populations to spectral predation had been as much a function of isolation and mutual mistrust as of technological or magical disadvantage, suggesting that cooperation and communication across dimensional boundaries might provide the best defense against future cosmic threats. The unicorns who had survived the Ainel's conquest of their world found themselves free to restore the natural balance that had been disrupted by centuries of forced cooperation with interdimensional raiders, their abilities no longer constrained to serve purposes that violated their essential nature. The dimensional pathways they had been forced to maintain for wild hunt operations were allowed to close naturally, while new portals were opened according to principles of harmony and mutual benefit, rather than exploitation and dominance. The restoration of unicorn autonomy created new possibilities for beneficial contact between worlds that had been isolated from each other during the centuries of wild hunt dominance, as these pure-hearted creatures used their abilities to facilitate cultural and technological exchange based on cooperation rather than conquest. The knowledge and wisdom that had been hoarded by elven civilization began to flow freely between dimensions, enriching countless worlds while demonstrating the superior effectiveness of sharing over accumulation as a method for achieving genuine progress and prosperity. The cosmic forces that had been disrupted by the Wild Hunt's attempts to weaponize fundamental phenomena like the White Frost began to return to their natural patterns and purposes, no longer constrained by artificial frameworks designed to channel their power toward destructive ends. The dimensional instabilities that had been created by centuries of forced portal manipulation gradually healed, while the temporal distortions that had made escape from Wild Hunt captivity so traumatic slowly returned to the normal flow that allowed beings to experience time as a coherent and meaningful progression rather than a chaotic jumble of disconnected moments. Even the White Frost itself, that cosmic phenomenon that had driven the Ain-El from their original homeworld and eventually consumed their dimensional sanctuary, revealed new aspects of its nature once it was no longer being actively resisted or attempts made to harness its power for military purposes. What had appeared to be an indiscriminate force of destruction proved to be part of larger cycles of cosmic renewal, clearing away civilizations that had become too rigid or exploitative to continue serving beneficial purposes, while preparing the way for new forms of existence that could develop in harmony with fundamental natural principles. The recognition that the White Frost was not an enemy to be defeated, but a natural force to be understood and accepted, created new possibilities for survival and transcendence that went beyond anything the Ain-El had achieved through their centuries of desperate flight and violent expansion. Those who learned to work with rather than against such cosmic phenomena discovered that apparent destruction could become transformation, while seeming endings could serve as beginnings for forms of existence that transcended the limitations that had previously seemed absolute and unchangeable. In the end, the Wild Hunt's legacy lived on not in the terror they had inspired or the suffering they had caused, but in the wisdom that their rise and fall had taught about the true nature of power and the proper relationship between strength and responsibility. Their story became a cautionary tale told across multiple dimensions, a reminder that the greatest threats to freedom and dignity often came not from obvious monsters, but from those who convinced themselves that their superiority gave them the right to treat others as resources for exploitation, rather than as fellow beings deserving of respect and consideration. The courage of those who had stood against the Wild Hunt despite overwhelming odds became the foundation for new traditions of resistance and mutual aid that spread throughout the multiverse, creating networks of cooperation and support that made future predatory organizations far less likely to achieve the kind of dominance that the spectral riders had once wielded across countless worlds. The knowledge that even the most powerful and sophisticated enemies could be defeated through unity and determination inspired countless acts of heroism and self-sacrifice that transformed the cosmic order in ways that no single victory could have achieved. Rest now, knowing that some hunts end not with capture but with liberation, that even the longest winters must eventually yield to spring, and that love proves stronger than any darkness the universe can conjure. The Wild Hunt rides no more through dimensions of terror and despair, and the dawn that follows their passing shines brighter for the contrast with the shadows they cast across so many worlds for so many centuries. In their defeat lies victory for all who believe that freedom and dignity are not privileges to be granted by the strong but rights that belong to every conscious being by virtue of their very existence in the cosmic tapestry that connects all things across all dimensions of space and time.